Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories.
My house was always filled with noise. If I wasn't waking up to the sound of my two sisters arguing over something trivial, I was being dragged from my bed by my dad, insisting I help him with sanding the boat he'd been building in the backyard for months. Life was loud, chaotic, and honestly, I wouldn't have had it any other way. But one Sunday morning, everything changed. I woke up to complete silence. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was strange not to hear my mother bustling around the kitchen, flipping pancakes and calling for me to come down for breakfast. Usually, by this time, my sisters would have already been bickering over the bathroom, and Dad would be clattering around with his tools. I rolled out of bed, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and stumbled downstairs, expecting to find the house empty. But when I entered the kitchen, my mother was there, standing at the counter chopping vegetables, her back to me. "Mom," I asked, still groggy, "why didn't you call me for breakfast?" She didn't respond. She didn't even turn around fully, just gave a brief glance at me over her shoulder, and went back to cutting vegetables. "Mom, are you mad at me or something?" I stepped closer, trying to catch her attention. Nothing. It felt odd. Usually, she was chatty and warm, always quick to give a smile or at least a scolding if I'd done something wrong. But this silence, it was unsettling. "Fine, whatever," I muttered under my breath and went looking for Dad. Maybe he could explain what was going on. I found him sitting in his favorite armchair in the living room, staring at the blank TV. Normally, he'd be tinkering with something or planning his next boat project, but today he just sat there, not saying a word, not even acknowledging me as I approached. "Dad," I asked, standing in front of him, "what's going on?" "Mom's acting really weird." He looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw something in his eyes. Fear, guilt, I couldn't be sure, but whatever it was, it made my stomach churn. He quickly looked away, refusing to meet my gaze. "What the hell is going on?" I said, louder now, frustration building inside me. Again, silence. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. This wasn't normal. My parents were never like this. My mind raced, trying to figure out if I'd done something wrong, something to make them angry at me. But nothing came to mind. Feeling more confused than ever, I rushed upstairs to find my sisters. Surely, they would be their usual obnoxious selves, ready to annoy me or tease me for some stupid reason. I knocked on their door, but there was no response. I could hear them inside, whispering softly. I opened the door to find Becky and Casey sitting on their beds, their faces pale and drained, like they hadn't slept in days. They looked up at me but said nothing, just stared, wide-eyed and anxious. "Are you two in on this too?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is this some sort of prank?" "Because it's not funny anymore." Still, nothing. They exchanged nervous glances, as if they wanted to say something but couldn't. I grabbed one of Becky's shoes off the floor and hurled it at her, hoping to get some kind of reaction. It hit her on the shoulder, and she flinched, but still, not a word. "If you don't want to talk, fine. Just keep playing your stupid game." I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was going on. My heart raced as a wave of anxiety settled in my chest. By the time evening rolled around, things had only gotten worse. I came downstairs to find my family gathered around the kitchen table. My mom was still chopping vegetables, her finger wrapped in a bandage that I hadn't noticed before. My dad sat at the head of the table, staring blankly at his hands, while my sisters sat across from him, their faces pale and distant. "Seriously, this has to stop now," I shouted. "Whatever prank you're pulling, it's freaking me out." They didn't respond, not even a glance in my direction. I reached out and placed my hand on my mom's shoulder. "Mom, please, just tell me what's going on." She pulled away from me as if my touch burned her. The knife in her hand slipped, slicing into her finger. I gasped as blood began to pool on the cutting board. "Mom, you're bleeding," I cried, stepping back in horror. But she didn't react. She just kept chopping, her face a mask of indifference. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to my dad. "Dad, please, look at her. She's hurt." But he didn't move. He didn't even flinch. It was as if they were all frozen, trapped in some sort of trance. That night, I locked myself in my room, trying to make sense of what had happened. Why was my family acting this way? What had I done to deserve this treatment? As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint rustling outside my door. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, listening intently. Suddenly, a small piece of paper slid under the door. I hesitated for a moment before getting up to retrieve it. My hands shook as I unfolded the note. "They're watching us. Your loving sister, Becky." My heart sank. What did she mean by they? Who was watching us? I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but fear kept me glued to my spot. The next morning, I came downstairs, hoping that everything would have returned to normal. But it hadn't. My mom, dad, and sister Casey were sitting at the kitchen table, whispering softly to one another. As soon as I entered the room, they fell silent, their eyes shifting nervously. "Where's Becky?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. They said nothing, but the way they avoided my gaze told me that something terrible had happened to her. "Who's watching us?" I demanded, tears welling up in my eyes. "What's happening?" They remained silent, their faces filled with guilt and fear. I felt a surge of anger and helplessness. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. "Hello. My name is Adam Best. I live at 13 Armenting Street. I think my sister has been kidnapped." The line crackled with static before going completely silent. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered, throwing the phone down. That night, as I sat on my bed, trying to make sense of everything, something caught my eye. In the far corner of my room, barely visible in the dim light, was a small, black camera. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that someone had been watching me, watching us, this whole time. I covered the camera with a piece of cloth, my hands trembling. Just as I sat back down, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging my room into darkness. My bedroom door burst open, and there, standing in the doorway, were my mom, dad, and sister Casey. "We're sorry," my mom whispered. "We didn't want it to come to this, but we have no choice." I took a step back, my heart racing. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "They're coming for you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You need to run. Now." "Who's coming for me?" I cried, panic surging through me. "The neighborhood watch," my dad said, his voice trembling with fear. I grabbed my bike from the shed and pedaled as fast as I could down the street. As I rode, I noticed my neighbors standing on their porches, watching me in silence. Their eyes followed me, cold and unblinking. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to escape whatever was coming for me. As I rode into the night, all I could think about was the terrifying realization that I might never see my family again. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if they were the ones I needed to be running from. How does one comprehend the impossible, the truly impossible? But perhaps this is more the improbable, as this actually happened to me. I lived a perfectly mundane life until a few weeks ago, when everything changed. Now, I can barely leave my house without feeling its presence racing through my mind. It's like a haunting, an image so vivid it feels as though it's standing right in front of me. I'm trapped in that moment, tortured by memories I cannot escape. So, I'm writing this as a warning, something to leave behind in case I'm never heard from again. Don't go into the woods. It all started on a regular Tuesday afternoon at the supermarket where I work. I was behind the register, scanning items with a glazed look in my eye, waiting for the day to end. That's when my best friend, who I'll call T for privacy reasons, called me out of the blue. He asked if I could take the next few days off to go camping with him and some friends. Since I had some vacation days saved up, I said I'd check with my manager. It wasn't unusual for T to call me spontaneously. He's the free-spirited type who's always up for adventure. Rock climbing, hiking, surfing, even paragliding. Camping seemed tame by comparison, so I didn't think much of it at the time. If only I had known what I was in for. We were headed to a place called Achopko Lake, which T had discovered during one of his recent hikes. The lake was stunning, crystal clear water and thick spruce trees surrounding us, making it feel as though we were in our own little world. You could barely see 10 feet into the forest due to the density of the trees. It was a hidden paradise, far off the beaten path, but only about 3 miles from where we parked. Despite how secluded it felt, I couldn't understand why more people didn't know about the place. Our group consisted of T, his girlfriend L, our high school buddies E and J, and me. I had known E and J since high school, but T had been my best friend since childhood. L, on the other hand, I'd only met a couple of times before. Despite that, we all got along well enough, or at least we did, until everything went wrong. The first day was pretty standard for a camping trip. We set up our tents, built a fire pit, and hung our food in the trees, just in case there were bears in the area. T and E joked about the possibility, but I wasn't taking any chances. I had brought my rifle with me, hoping to maybe catch a deer while we were out here. As we worked on setting up E and J's tent, I felt an odd sensation creep over me, like something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I wasn't the only one who noticed. E's face mirrored my unease, though he didn't say anything. Once camp was set up, we gathered around the fire with some beers and sandwiches that L had packed before we left. The conversation turned to light-hearted stories, like the time J bet T he couldn't climb a lamp post and T ended up falling on top of him. The laughter was infectious, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But then it happened. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, inhuman, agonizing, and it seemed to come from every direction at once. We all froze, the laughter dying on our lips, replaced by the cold grip of terror. We quickly retreated to our tents, each of us pretending we weren't scared out of our minds. I lay awake all night, rifle in hand, listening to the deafening silence that followed the scream. The next morning, none of us had slept much, if at all. The air was thick with fog, and the fire had burned down to the last embers. We huddled around the fire, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fear. T was the first to break it. What the hell was that last night? We all chimed in with theories. Maybe a mountain lion, Jay suggested. They scream like that sometimes. Could it have been someone hurt in the woods? Elle asked, trying to keep her voice steady. We didn't know, and that was the worst part. It was all just guesses. Elle tried to change the subject by making breakfast, but when we went to retrieve our food from the tree, we found the remains of what used to be our supplies. The meat, burgers, steaks, ribs, was all gone, and the packaging was scattered on the ground. T muttered something about bears, but I pointed out that if it had been a bear, everything would have been eaten, not just the meat. Besides, where were the scavengers? Not even birds or insects had touched the remnants. That's when I realized what had been bothering me all along. The woods were silent. No birds, no insects, just the wind rustling through the trees. It was unnatural. We returned to camp, unnerved and ready to leave. We packed up quickly, eager to put this place behind us, but just as we were about to leave, we heard he scream for help. We turned, only to realize he had wandered into the woods moments before to relieve himself. His scream echoed through the trees, but there was something off about it. It lacked emotion, like it was being played on a loop. We rushed into the forest, me with my rifle, T with a pistol he'd brought along, but no matter how far we went, his scream never got closer. It felt like we were running in circles, trapped in some twisted loop. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dense canopy, we stumbled into a clearing. To our horror, it was our camp, the same place we'd just left. But now it was eerily empty. The tents were gone, but the fire pit remained. As I approached the fire pit, something caught my eye. In the shadows of the trees, I saw his body, torn and mangled, hung upside down from a tree by his feet. But it wasn't the tree holding him. It was something else, something impossible. His lifeless body swayed in the breeze, blood dripping down, staining the ground beneath him. His face was twisted in agony, eyes wide open in a silent scream. That's when I realized, whatever was in these woods wasn't done with us yet. And that's why I'm telling you now, don't go into the woods. Don't listen to the screams. Don't follow the echoes, because if you do, you might not come back. The creature that stood before me, clutching my friend's lifeless body, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Standing at around 8 feet tall, its pale, almost translucent skin seemed to glow under the moonlight. Its thin, emaciated frame made the large, distended belly even more grotesque. The claws on its hands and feet were long and sharp, glistening with fresh blood. But it was its eyes that terrified me the most, two sunken orbs pure black, darker than anything I could imagine. Its face twisted into a thin, crooked smile, blood dripping from its lips. With a sickening thud, the creature dropped my friend's body and turned its attention to me. It moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. Just as I thought it would reach me, T fired his rifle. The bullet struck the creature's leg, and it let out a blood-curdling scream, not in its voice, but in the voice of our recently dead friend. The sound was enough to make my blood run cold. Instead of red, black blood oozed from its wound. The creature turned to T, and with a single swipe of its claw, it sent him flying into the trees. His body collided with a thick branch, the sound of the impact echoing through the silent forest. He didn't scream. There wasn't even a moan, just a sickening thud. And then, From the creature's still smiling mouth came a scream, an inhuman, high-pitched wail like that of a dying woman. It pierced the night air, sending a shiver down my spine. Elle was next. She let out a scream, a desperate, heart-wrenching sound like a mother grieving the loss of a child. The creature moved towards her, its long claws slicing through the air with terrifying precision. It grabbed her by the head, lifting her off the ground with ease. For a moment, their eyes met, and then, with a horrifying smile still plastered on its face, the creature tore her body in half. Blood sprayed everywhere, staining the grass and turning the once beautiful clearing into a sea of red. Her torso hit the ground with a wet thud, and I watched in horror as she tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood behind her. I was frozen in place, unable to comprehend what was happening. My friends were being slaughtered in front of me, and I could do nothing but watch in stunned silence. The creature, apparently satisfied with its carnage, suddenly turned and sprinted off into the forest. It moved so quickly that I could barely track it as it disappeared into the trees, dragging T's limp body along with it. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into darkness. J was the only one left with me. He lay on the ground, curled up in the fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably. I pulled him up, my own body trembling with fear. I held him tightly, trying to provide some sense of comfort, though I was barely holding it together myself. He looked at me with tear-filled eyes and asked, "What are we going to do?" I had no answer. This wasn't some horror movie where the hero stands up and declares that they're going to fight back. I was terrified, so scared that I could barely stand. My legs were shaking so badly that I thought they would give out any second. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to die in that cursed forest. "We have to get to the car," I finally said, my voice shaking. It was only 3 miles away, but it felt like an impossible distance, especially with the creature lurking somewhere in the woods. But we had no other choice. If we stayed, we'd die. We moved slowly at first, creeping through the dense forest, my rifle aimed at the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. The creature was close. I could feel it watching us, stalking us. I heard it behind us, then to the left, then the right. It was toying with us, encircling us like a predator playing with its prey. But it didn't attack. Not yet. We picked up our pace, eventually breaking into a full sprint. I didn't know why the creature hadn't killed us yet, but I wasn't going to question it. We had to keep moving. But just as we neared the edge of the forest, the sounds stopped. Not just the sound of the creature, but everything, the wind, the birds, the insects. It was as if the world had gone silent. Then, out of nowhere, it attacked. I managed to pull Jay forward just in time, sparing him from a fatal blow, but the creature's claws caught his ankle, nearly severing his foot. He screamed in agony, blood pouring from the wound. I hoisted him over my shoulder and ran as fast as I could. I don't know how, but we made it to the edge of the forest. The car was just ahead, and I could see the faint outline of the road. I set Jay down on the ground and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I turned back, the creature was standing at the tree line, watching us. It didn't move. It just stood there, its black eyes fixed on us, its smile as wide and menacing as ever. It almost looked afraid, afraid to cross the boundary between the forest and the road. And then, without warning, it turned and sprinted back into the darkness. I threw Jay into the car and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until we reached the nearest hospital. Jay was barely alive when we arrived, and by the time the doctors wheeled him inside, it was too late. He had lost too much blood. I sat in the hospital lobby, numb, as they took him to the morgue. The last of my friends was gone. The police were called, of course. They questioned me, searched the forest, but they found nothing. No creature, no bodies. They didn't believe me. They said it was probably some deranged lunatic living in the woods. A manhunt was launched, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. So here I am alone, writing this as a warning to anyone who might read it. Don't go into the woods. Back in early August of last year, my husband Quarren and I went on vacation. We were planning to do the tourist thing in one of the South's larger cities, but our trip was off to a rough start. First, we got stuck in baggage check-in for 2 hours. The self-check-in machines couldn't read our passports. After finally making it through, we got held up again at the security checkpoint where they inspected all our luggage. Because of all this, we missed our flight, our connecting flight, and a hotel transfer. Needless to say, we weren't happy. After some rebooking, we ended up with a total of 7 hours of delays, eventually arriving at the hotel at around 11 p.m. But then, as if we hadn't been through enough, it turned out we'd been double booked, and the hotel was full. I was about to lose my temper, while Quarren looked like he wanted to disappear. Thankfully, the hotel had another location downtown. It was more modern, pricier, and overall nicer. As a courtesy for their mistake, we got an upgrade to a suite. Finally, a stroke of good luck, we took an Uber to the new hotel. The place was practically brand new and high-tech. Instead of a physical key, we got personalized codes that worked for both the outer door and our room. While Quarren handled the codes, I signed us in. The hotel had a 24/7 bodega with organic snacks and drinks right by the lobby, a sushi restaurant that closed just before we arrived, plus amenities like a sauna, gym, and indoor pool. They also threw in complimentary robes and a bottle of wine as a small apology for the trouble. Quarren hopped in the shower while I unpacked and ordered us some food since all the nearby restaurants were closed. As instructed, I provided our room code to the delivery service so they could drop the food at the door. By the time our dinner arrived, I was in the middle of my own shower. Quarren, ever the opportunist, devoured most of the food before I even got out. "It's so good," he exclaimed, barely leaving me any. They'd included 2 orders of tiramisu as a surprise, but I had to skip them because of my coconut allergy. All things considered, our night turned out pretty well. We shared what was left of the lukewarm meal, watched The Office, and crawled into bed. As we talked over our plans for the next day, a distillery tour, a museum visit, and dinner at a steakhouse, we finally fell asleep. But the real story began at 3 a.m. That's when someone opened our door. See, what I hadn't realized was that the code for the outer door was the same as for our room. The hotel used a single personal code system. Quarren had handled it all, and I hadn't thought much about it. So, when I provided the delivery driver with our code, I'd essentially handed them access to our room. And now, someone was coming inside. I tried to shake Quarren awake, but he didn't respond. He was completely out, which was strange. I could smell something sour on his breath, and my mind raced back to the tiramisu he'd eaten. I hadn't touched it, but what if it had been tampered with? The door creaked as it closed, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Footsteps moved cautiously across the carpet. I could make out at least 2 people, maybe 3, "Just the guy," one of them whispered. "Bag him." They were unwrapping plastic, methodically and without urgency. Clearly, they had done this before. Panic set in, but I made a split-second decision to pretend I was asleep. If they were just there to take Quarren, maybe they'd leave me alone. I held my breath and clung to him, hoping they'd finish and go. But then, I heard a hushed exchange between them. "Wait," one of them said. "The spoon." Quarren had eaten both portions of the tiramisu, but one of the spoons was left untouched. They knew someone else was in the room, someone who hadn't taken the bait. The next thing I knew, rough hands grabbed me. A hand clamped over my mouth, and I was yanked out of bed. I opened my eyes to see 3 shadowy figures standing over me. They whispered frantically, arguing about what to do. One of them suggested leaving. Another insisted they had to take me too. And then I felt a cold metal object press against the back of my neck. "One word, and you're done," a voice growled. "Then we get him. Understand?" I nodded, terrified. I couldn't imagine leaving Quarren behind, but I had no choice. "Get dressed," they ordered. Now, they escorted me through the staff-only area of the hotel, past the laundry room, and out a back exit. The hotel was practically deserted at this hour. The 3 men could easily smuggle me out without anyone noticing. Outside, they had a sedan marked with a fast food delivery logo waiting. The men were still arguing as they forced me into the back seat. Their original plan had clearly been to take Quarren, and they were scrambling to adjust. One of them removed his belt and used it as a makeshift blindfold, pulling a trucker hat low over my face to make it look less obvious at a glance. No one would have guessed this was a kidnapping. The man and woman standing shoulder to shoulder in their bright blue turtlenecks looked utterly unnatural. Their faces were blank, devoid of emotion, like mannequins propped up in some cruel display. For a second, I thought they might be other victims, but their strange stillness unnerved me. I glanced around, trying to gauge my surroundings. The rhythmic thumping had stopped, but the silence felt more dangerous than the sound ever did. I hesitated, caught between bolting away or approaching them. Maybe they knew something. Maybe they were part of this nightmare but could help. But as I took a step forward, they moved in unison, stiffly turning their heads toward me. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, like those of animals who had seen too much. Without warning, they both raised their arms in a slow, synchronized motion, pointing down the hall behind me. Their fingers trembled slightly, but their expressions didn't change. No words were spoken, just that eerie, mechanical gesture, as if they were trying to direct me towards something. The air felt heavy, and a sense of dread crept up my spine. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the fear of the unknown swelling inside me. I wanted to ask them something, anything, but my mouth felt dry, and my instincts screamed at me to run. Something about them wasn't right. Then I felt it, a shift in the air, a low hum in the walls, and suddenly the ground beneath me seemed to pulse. Something was coming again. I turned on my heel and sprinted back down the hall, away from the 2 figures. Their strange, frozen presence burned into my mind as I ran faster than I thought possible, my bare feet pounding the thick carpet. I didn't know what they were, but something told me that staying there would have been a grave mistake. As I ran, the hallways seemed to twist and warp. The wallpaper swirled grotesquely in the dim fluorescent light, and I felt as though I were running in circles. But I had no choice. Every fiber of my being was focused on survival. I passed more doors, each one locked, some with ominous scratches on them. I could hear faint whispers, disjointed and echoing, like they were carried on the draft created by the unseen fans. It was maddening, but I forced myself to keep going. Suddenly, I heard it again, the heavy thumping, closer this time. Whatever it was had found me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Yet the sound grew louder and more insistent, the footfalls now a steady march that echoed through the corridor. I stumbled into an open room at the end of the hall. The door slammed shut behind me, and I frantically searched for a way to block it. My hands shook as I dragged a heavy metal chair in front of the door, wedging it beneath the handle. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was small, barely furnished. In the center was a circular platform, like an operating table, and the walls were lined with strange machinery. It looked like a medical room, but nothing about it felt sterile. The air reeked of chemicals, and the floor was sticky beneath my feet. I glanced around, searching for any clue as to where I was or how to get out. But all I could see were grotesque medical instruments, some covered in thick blue residue like what I'd seen outside the double doors. The thumping stopped just outside the room. My heart skipped a beat. I crouched down behind the platform, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear movement just beyond the door, slow, deliberate shuffling. Something or someone was trying the handle. It rattled, then stopped. Silence fell again, broken only by my own labored breathing. Then a loud bang echoed through the room. The door didn't open, but I could hear the heavy footsteps pacing back and forth outside, as if whatever was out there was deciding what to do next. I stayed as still as I could, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. My only hope was that the barricaded door would hold, but deep down, I knew that whatever was out there could break through if it really wanted to. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally receded. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But my relief was short-lived. The platform in the center of the room began to hum, a low mechanical sound that vibrated through the floor. Lights flickered above me, and the machinery lining the walls powered on, casting an eerie glow across the room. I took a step back, watching in horror as the platform started to rotate slowly, revealing something beneath it, a hidden compartment. The stench of decay hit me hard, making me gag. Inside the compartment was a large metal cage, and in it, something moved. Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the door behind me exploded inward with a deafening crash, and then I saw it. The thing that had been chasing me stepped into the room. In the spring of 2018, my fiancée and I made a decision that would change our lives. We moved to her family's farm, a peaceful place bordering the Washita National Forest. Our small, termite-ridden house needed replacing, and with limited funds, we reluctantly settled on a double-wide mobile home as a temporary solution until we could build our dream home. The land surrounding the farm was a hunter's paradise, with 50 acres of private land and the endless expanse of the Washita National Forest. To outsiders, the forest may not seem imposing, but its ancient, weathered mountains hold a deep history, older than most can comprehend. However, the land came with a strange atmosphere, an uncomfortable sensation, especially behind the barn. I always felt watched when I ventured there, and something about it never sat right with me. The property next to ours had once been home to a haunted inn, burned down long ago. Tales of stagecoach robberies, poker games gone bad, and even rumors of Jesse James' gang filled the air. Maybe it was this history that gave the land its eerie feel, but things took a darker turn soon after we moved in. One night, While walking out to feed the goats, my fiancée suddenly stopped and pointed toward the trees. "Something big just ran through the yard," she whispered. I tensed up, asking how big. We had bears around here, but she said it was more like a huge black dog. We hopped in the jeep, and with headlights illuminating the tree line, we saw it, a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at us. The shape was unmistakable, a large, black dog-like creature, standing unnaturally still. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached, trying to call it over, but something was off. The closer I got, the more I noticed how wrong it looked. No matter how much light I shined, the creature seemed to absorb it, a void of darkness that swallowed any detail beyond those glowing eyes. I shook it off, thinking it was a neighbor's dog, but deep down, I knew something was strange. A few days later, my fiancée's grandmother asked about our black dog. Puzzled, I told her we didn't have one. She swore she had seen it following me the other day when I had gone over to her house. The following night, around 2 a.m., our dogs went wild, barking and growling like something was threatening them. I crept to the door and flipped on the porch light. There it was again, standing right on my steps, sniffing at the door. Its size dwarfed our dog's, and as soon as I flipped the light on, it turned and bolted into the night with an eerie speed. My skin crawled as I noticed its long, bushy tail and pointed ears. This wasn't just any dog. It was something far more terrifying. Over the next few days, the sightings continued. My brother-in-law, who lived nearby, called me one night, saying his pit bull had been going berserk, barking at something in the woods. When he shined his flashlight, he saw the same yellow eyes staring back. He described it just as I had, a massive black void that absorbed light. On the night of our wedding, my brother-in-law encountered the creature again, this time standing over a fawn. He grabbed his shotgun and fired, but instead of the yellow eyes disappearing, a second set of blue eyes appeared. The fawn had been caught, and while dazed, it staggered away into the woods. He swore the black wolf had been ready to devour it, but when he checked, there was no blood, no sign of injury. Things quieted down for a while, but the eerie feeling of being watched never left. I would often find claw marks high up on trees, too high for any normal animal. And whenever I skinned deer at the barn, something would move in the thicket, always just out of sight, would stop whenever I shined a light, but the moment I turned away, the sound of something pacing would start again. Years passed without any sign of the creature, but then the nightmares began. Waking up in cold sweats, feeling its presence outside. Our dogs would lose their minds at night, barking at nothing. One night, I heard screams coming from the goat pen. I rushed out, but I was too late. One of our goats had vanished, and the rest were trembling, huddled in a corner. I could hear the goat's cries as it was carried off into the darkness, up the mountain at an unnatural speed. I couldn't take it any more. Something needed to be done. I scoured the internet for answers, but found nothing, so I turned to folklore. I melted silver into my bullets, loaded my rifle, and prepared for battle. This thing wasn't just an animal, it was something ancient, something evil. One night, as I watched the property from the roof, I spotted it creeping toward the goats. My heart raced as I took aim. I fired, but the rifle clicked. In my haste, I had forgotten to take the safety off. The black wolf stood on its hind legs and let out a roar that vibrated through my chest. I quickly cocked the hammer and fired again. The creature dropped to the ground, thrashed, and then bolted into the woods. At dawn, I ventured into the woods, following the trail of overturned leaves and broken twigs. The stench of rot led me to the edge of the property, where I found a hunk of rotten flesh. The trail eventually led me to an abandoned cave, marked with strange symbols and an unbearable smell. I knew the creature was hiding inside, but I wasn't about to follow it in. That was 3 years ago. Since then, the black wolf hasn't returned. But every year, I leave a deer at the corner of the property as an offering. And every year, it's gone by the next morning. The sound of the baby crying sent a chill through me. My instincts screamed that something was off. Who leaves a baby in the woods at this time of night? I sat in my truck, heart racing, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, or some kids playing a cruel joke. But the cries were too genuine, too desperate. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, trying to see if there was any sign of movement. The branches swayed slightly, but the baby's cries echoed eerily, filling the air with an unsettling tension. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence hung heavy for a moment before the wailing intensified, almost as if responding to my call. I was torn between my instinct to help and the dread creeping up my spine. I reached for my phone, considering calling for help, but my gut told me that wouldn't help. The nearest house was miles away. I had to check it out myself. Steeling my nerves, I opened the door and stepped out into the damp, cool night. The darkness enveloped me, and the weight of the forest pressed in on all sides. The cries seemed to come from just beyond the tree line. "Hang on, I'm coming," I shouted, forcing my feet to move forward. I stepped carefully, dodging branches and overgrown roots, moving toward the sound. With each step, my heart pounded louder in my chest. The air was thick with an earthy scent, and I could hear the rustle of leaves underfoot. As I approached the tree line, I stopped. The crying stopped too. "Hello," I called again, my voice wavering. "I can help you." There was no response, just silence. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Should I keep going? Just then, I heard a soft rustle behind me. I spun around, but it was only the wind. I turned back to the woods, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. I took a step closer, peering into the darkness. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, and I stumbled back, nearly falling. "Who's there?" I shouted, adrenaline pumping through my veins. But all I got in response was the echo of my own voice, swallowed by the trees. The cries resumed, now more frantic, almost like a plea. I hesitated. I could turn back now, forget this whole thing. But what if it was real? What if there really was a baby out there? With a deep breath, I pressed forward. The moment I stepped into the clearing, I froze. Then, nestled against the roots of an ancient oak, was a bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. The cries were coming from it, piercing and heart-wrenching. I could hardly believe it. I approached slowly, cautiously, my heart racing. As I knelt beside it, I noticed the bundle was stained. Dark, sticky patches marred the fabric. I reached out, trembling. Then, just as I was about to pull back the cloth, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. I whipped around, my pulse racing. A figure loomed in the darkness, and for a moment, all I could do was stare. The months passed, and while the black wolf remained absent, the memories of its presence lingered like a shadow. Each rustle in the bushes or crack of a twig set my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. Every evening, I would sit on the porch, scanning the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of the creature, but dreading what I might find. The nights grew longer, and the silence of the woods became deafening, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet, the sense of unease never fully faded. One chilly evening in late autumn, while the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, I decided to venture out to the edge of the woods. Armed with my rifle, now a symbol of my resolve, I made my way down the familiar path, the moonlight casting ghostly shadows around me. The forest felt alive, every sound amplified in the stillness. As I approached the clearing where I'd seen the creature before, I noticed something peculiar. The ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had passed through. I followed the trail, heart pounding in my chest, each step echoing the thoughts swirling in my mind. What if it had returned? What if it had come for revenge? Then I saw it, a massive paw print, unlike any animal I had ever seen. It was deep, as if something had pressed down with immense weight. I knelt to examine it, when a chilling howl pierced the night, reverberating through the trees. It was a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, a blend of a wolf's cry and something far more sinister. I stumbled back, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I wasn't ready to confront it. Not yet. I turned to head back to the house, but a rustling in the bushes made me stop dead in my tracks. The unmistakable glow of yellow eyes emerged from the darkness, watching me. Panic surged as I realized I was not alone. The creature stepped into the moonlight, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. The black wolf, larger than I remembered, stood there, its coat absorbing the faint light, making it appear as though it were part of the night itself. It tilted its head, almost curiously, as if assessing me. In that moment, fear paralyzed me. Memories flooded back, of my brother-in-law's encounter, the fawn it had stalked. Was it hunting me now? I raised my rifle, hands shaking, but the creature remained still. It didn't charge. It just watched, as if waiting for me to make the first move. Then, as if sensing my turmoil, it let out a low growl, a warning. I hesitated, torn between instinct and the urge to flee. I had prepared for this moment, yet I felt utterly unprepared. The beast took a step forward, its breath visible in the cold air, and something inside me snapped. I fired. The bullet whistled through the night, striking the ground near its paws. The wolf recoiled, snarling, but didn't retreat. Instead, it stood its ground, a challenge in its eyes. I felt a surge of determination rise within me. I had come too far to back down now. I reloaded quickly, my heart racing. With each heartbeat, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I aimed again, this time steadier, and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the trees, and the wolf let out a piercing howl, not of pain, but of anger. The creature bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I stood frozen for a moment, the adrenaline fading as dread set in. I had fired at it, but had I truly accomplished anything? The atmosphere shifted, thickening with an impending sense of doom. Days turned into weeks, and though the wolf didn't return, the unease remained. Each night, I found myself leaving offerings at the edge of the property, small tokens of peace, hoping to appease whatever force lurked in the shadows. A deer's heart here, a few feathers there. I had to believe that something could bridge the gap between us, that maybe, just maybe, I could coexist with the mystery that surrounded our home. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I was jolted awake by a commotion outside. The dogs were barking wildly, their frantic sounds echoing through the stillness. I rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. There, at the edge of the woods, I saw it, Two sets of glowing eyes, one yellow, the other a haunting blue, both watching me intently. My heart dropped as the reality of the situation set in. The black wolf hadn't forgotten me, and it was back, this time with company. Panic surged through me as I read the note. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My wife was out there, driving through those dark woods, looking for me. I couldn't let her go alone, not after what I'd just experienced. I hurried to grab my jacket and slipped on my shoes. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. I grabbed my phone, hoping it would work this time. I dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustration mounted. I couldn't waste any more time. I rushed outside and jumped into my truck. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The familiar route felt foreign and threatening now. Every shadow flickered with the memory of those yellow eyes, and the chilling cries echoed in my mind. I had to find her. As I approached the entrance to the shortcut, I slowed down, scanning the tree line for any signs of her vehicle. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a suffocating blanket. The moon struggled to break through the dense clouds, casting an unsettling gloom over the path ahead. I turned onto the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Each sound, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the darkness. No response. I parked the truck and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin. I listened intently, straining to hear anything, her voice, the sound of a car door, anything. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering, not far off. My heart dropped. It sounded like a child. I sprinted towards the sound, hoping against hope it was her. As I pushed through the underbrush, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rancid. "Sarah," I called again, but my voice felt weak, muffled by the weight of dread settling in my stomach. The whimpering turned into a full-blown cry, echoing through the trees. It was close. Suddenly, a figure darted between the trees, a flash of movement, and my pulse quickened. I rushed toward it, only to freeze as a large, dark shape emerged from the shadows. It was massive, standing on all fours, its eyes gleaming like twin lanterns in the dark. A wave of terror washed over me as I recognized that shape, but it was different this time. It was more solid, more menacing, and the long, bushy tail whipped back and forth, as if it was toying with me. In that moment, I felt paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the instinct to protect. The cries grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the clearing ahead. Mustering every ounce of courage, I dashed forward, adrenaline propelling me. Breaking through the trees, I stumbled into the clearing. The sight before me was surreal. Sarah stood by the edge, her silhouette barely visible against the faint light. She was kneeling beside the car, her face twisted in fear as she held something tightly, a small bundle. "John," she cried, her voice trembling, "help me." The creature loomed closer, its growl reverberating through the air, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down my spine. It was ready to pounce. Without thinking, I sprinted towards Sarah, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the car. "Get in," I shouted, pushing her toward the passenger side. I glanced back at the beast as it charged. My mind raced. What could I do? I fumbled for my phone, praying it would work this time, but the screen was dead. We tumbled into the truck, and I slammed the door shut, locking it just as the creature reached us. It stood on its hind legs, pressing its massive paws against the window, its breath fogging the glass. I could see its eyes, those haunting yellow eyes, staring right into mine. "Drive!" Sarah shouted, panic rising in her voice. I turned the key, but my hands were shaking so violently that it took 2 tries to get the engine roaring to life. I slammed the gear into drive and hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, and I could feel the creature's weight shaking the vehicle as it chased us down the dirt road. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but the shadows felt alive, shifting and morphing around us. "Faster!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely cutting through the roar of the engine. The trees blurred by as I pushed the accelerator down harder, the adrenaline fueling my desperate flight. I could hear the creature's growls fading into the distance, but the fear gnawed at me. It wasn't over yet. We reached the main road, and I didn't stop. I kept driving, racing toward the safety of streetlights and familiar territory. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily in the truck, a silence wrapped in disbelief and terror. "John, what was that thing?" Sarah's voice broke the tension, trembling as she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, the reality of the night crashing down on me. "But we're safe now." As we drove, the darkness behind us seemed to stretch on forever. And though we escaped that night, I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. Can someone help me? My name's Vivi. I'm 19, and I'm trying to escape my town, New Haven. If any kids from New Haven see this, please let me know. I'll explain the details at the end of this post, but just so you know, I'm hiding behind the wall near the town exit. If you're an adult and come near me, I will shoot you. Let me start from the beginning. 2 weeks ago, I was living in a world I thought was destroyed. An apocalypse. I had to eat Ren. He tasted like chicken. They told me to cover him in BBQ sauce to make it easier to swallow, but he was still dry and stringy. I couldn't stop thinking about him stuck between my teeth. This was the only way of life I knew. Father told us to treat Ren like food, to detach ourselves. But I couldn't just let go of 18 years of memories with him. Ren wasn't just anyone. He had freckled cheeks and a lopsided smile. We grew up together, shared bunk beds, and he used to tell me scary stories at night to help me sleep. He was always there to lighten the mood, cracking jokes, even when he was scared. He made things feel normal when nothing was. The night before he died, Ren climbed into my bed and told me about his parents. He believed they were still alive, and he was going to find them, once it was safe to go back to the surface. Ren didn't remember much about his early childhood, but he knew his parents were in the medical field. When he was chosen, he left me his favorite jacket, the one he'd worn since he was 3, the day Father found him. Now I wore it, but all I could think about was how much I missed him. Ren had told me not to be upset, not to miss him, but I did. His empty spot next to me felt like a gaping hole. I missed his late-night talks, missed the way he'd joke about silly things, like when I confessed at 9 years old that I had a crush on him. He laughed and said, "Maybe when we're older, you can ask me to marry you. If we'd been normal kids in a normal world, I would have. But now Ren was gone, and the taste of him made me feel sick. I wasn't even hungry, but Father insisted we had to eat. It was how we gave thanks for our safety, obeying Father's every order. I spat Ren out into my bowl. Across the table, Jack wrinkled his nose. Gross, he muttered. I shot him a glare. Jack was the oldest, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. Small and scrawny, Jack looked like he hadn't grown much in years. Still, he tried to act tough. Around us, the others ate quietly, lit by the dim, flickering candlelight. Father was telling his stories again, the same ones he'd been telling since we were kids. I knew them all by heart. The world had ended when we were 3 years old. Father called it the disaster, a horrifying event that turned all the adults into savage predators who hunted their own children. Nobody knew why. Some said it was a virus. Others thought it was natural human evolution. All living things eat their young, and now it was humanity's turn. Father told us how it felt to eat his own son. He described it like a thirst, something he couldn't control. It burned through his logic and love, turning him into a cold-blooded monster. Not a zombie, Father would always add. Zombies are mindless corpses brought back to life in movies. This was different. The adults didn't lose their minds. They lost their humanity. Father looked away from us. When I was affected by this thing, my son felt like an addiction, stronger than any drug. He cleared his throat. There was no right or wrong, no more morals. I was like an animal when I killed him, skinned him, and cooked him into a hot stew. His smile was twisted. I didn't feel any regret. I just wanted more. I wanted to eat until my stomach was full. His voice cracked. I killed and ate my son, and I didn't even care. I don't remember his name. This thing took that away too. It took my memories of him, my love for him, my need to protect him, and turned me into a monster. Father sighed deeply. But it didn't stop there. Once people realized that eating children's flesh didn't just satisfy cravings, but also granted youth and immortality, the world fell apart. World leaders were the first to break. At first, they tried to set up a treaty, a group called the Children's Association, to protect kids from feral adults. But there was no real Children's Association. Instead of saving kids, the government was eating them too. Older kids who survived were captured and brainwashed, trained to hunt the rest of us. The few of us who managed to hide were called threads. Apparently, our flesh was tough and stringy when eaten, like threads. Father had hidden us underground, away from the war between surviving children and the adults hunting them down like animals. He took 15 kids with him. Only 6 of us were left. I don't remember much about my life before the disaster, but I know I had a mom and dad. One day, they walked out the door, and I was left watching cartoons. Mom told me she'd be right back. Halfway through an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, Father picked me up and carried me away from my home to safety. Father admitted that his first plan was to eat us. He never lied about his cravings for flesh. He was just as monstrous as the adults hunting us. But then, he started giving us names. At first, naming us was a way to feel less guilty when he finally ate us. But once he named us, something changed. He began to act like a real parent. He started feeding and clothing us, reading us stories, and even singing lullabies to help us sleep. Slowly, he became attached to us, his food. As we grew up, Father taught us everything we needed to know, how to cook, how to read, how to survive. But his hunger never really went away. He promised to keep us safe from the adults on one condition. Every now and then, we had to make a sacrifice. Ren was the last one. He'd been gone for almost 6 months now. His body now frozen in chunks, stacked neatly in bowls. Maybe that's why I couldn't bring myself to eat. The thought of Ren in my bowl made me sick. Father was getting hungry for fresh meat again. For a while, I thought maybe his cravings had stopped. He'd been eating rice more often, but after he tore through Ren, I realized I was wrong. When father stood up suddenly, cutting off his story, the room went quiet. Jack and Elsa had been talking about a book, but when father reached for the deck of cards on the small table by the door, they fell silent, their eyes wide. Alia and Phoebe were already bracing for it. They hadn't spoken all day, both ignoring their food. Phoebe started to cry. I wanted to comfort her, but what could I say? I didn't want to be chosen either. Phoebe. Father's voice was sharp. Be quiet. Father never felt fully human to me, more like a shadow, just an outline of a person. I was glad I couldn't see the grin spreading across his face, only the movements of his jaw. The room suddenly felt too small, like it was going to swallow me whole. Our home had always been cramped, a rectangular bunker underground. The concrete walls absorbed the dull light from the bare bulbs hanging from the low ceiling. The air was damp and smelled like sulfur, making my skin feel sticky. Father never explained how he found this place, or what it used to be. He just called it home. The bunker was divided into two small sections, a communal area where we ate and spent our days, and a tiny sleeping space with thin, uncomfortable mattresses and one bunk bed. We had a storage room full of supplies father had collected over the years. There were no windows, and the only way out was a heavy, reinforced door leading to underground tunnels. The feeling of suffocation was familiar, like drowning in fear, knowing my time might be up. Jack couldn't stop tapping his foot, while Elsa and Cal stood frozen, their expressions hard to read. I had never thought much about what it would be like to be eaten. Sometimes I tried to imagine being a chicken. Father had a laptop we were allowed to use under his watch. It had no internet, but it was filled with his research on this phenomenon. He compared us to chickens, living beings with thoughts, memories, and families, dragged from their homes and slaughtered for food. Like adults, we didn't need chicken to survive. We wanted it. Adults craved us like an addiction. Father held out a deck of playing cards with a smile. I didn't believe. That smile wasn't to comfort us. He was hungry. All right, everyone. Let's play. His voice made me sick. We had no choice but to stand up. Jack was the first to rise, shaking. When Elsa and Kel didn't move, Jack pulled them to their feet. It hit me as father shuffled the cards, playfully nudging Jack with his shoulder. He never really meant to save us. He only kept us alive because he didn't want to be lonely. The six of us stood there, our faces tight with fear. It's impossible to explain that kind of terror, knowing you could die, knowing you could be eaten. The endless thoughts of what could have been haunted me. I could have grown up, gone to school, graduated. I could have had loving parents. I could have turned 20 and asked Ren to marry me. I could have left 2 years ago, when Ren begged me to run away with him. Vivi. Father's voice yanked me out of my thoughts. Suddenly, I was very aware that I was wearing Ren's jacket, the jacket of my dead best friend. My skin crawled, and I felt like bugs were filling my mouth. Ren had wanted to leave, but I told him we were safe with father. That was when there were more of us, less chance of being chosen. I didn't want to face the truth. I didn't want to admit that the real monster was right in front of me. But father cleared his throat, and I knew I had to play the game. I reached forward and picked a card from the deck. The rules were simple. 6 cards, 1 joker. Whoever pulled the joker would be father's next meal. I squeezed the card in my fist without looking at it. I could hear us all breathing, silently begging any god that might listen. Jack drew a queen, his face lighting up in relief as he stepped back. Elsa, shaking, drew a 4 of hearts. Cal hesitated before drawing a 6 of hearts, his face tight with concentration. Alio exhaled deeply. pulling a king from the deck. Phoebe, looking like she was going to throw up, drew a jack. Now, everyone was staring at me. 6 cards. 6 players. 1 joker. Suddenly, the bunker felt more like a slaughterhouse, the walls closing in on me. I remembered when Ren drew the joker. He had laughed uncontrollably, even as I tried to calm him, wrapping my arms around him and whispering that everything would be okay. He had sobbed into my shoulder, his voice trembling in my ear. We should have run. His voice had been filled with regret, regret that hit me harder now that I was in his place. Ren didn't smile at me when he died. He never forgave me. Why didn't we run? I couldn't understand why Ren had laughed that day. Why, even with those hollow eyes, he'd smiled like he had won. But now, with the joker in my hand, I felt it, the same hysterics rising in my throat. I started laughing, a sound that felt wrong, hollow, and strange, yet somehow, it felt good too. The idea of being eaten alive suddenly seemed so absurd that I collapsed onto my knees, shaking with uncontrollable laughter. I tried to stifle it with my hand over my mouth, but the revulsion kept slamming into me in waves. I had thought Ren was possessed by the Joker card. Now I understood it. I finally understood the complete despair that had washed over him. When the laughter finally died, my decision was made. I was going to die with a smile on my face, just like Ren. The others were staring at me with frowns, confusion, and pity. "I'm sorry, Vivi," Jack whispered, but his face said, "I'm just glad it's you and not me." Alia and Phoebe stepped back, as if my doom was something they could catch by standing too close. Cal offered a small smile, and that was enough. It wasn't pity, it was just a smile. I clenched the joker in my hand and prepared to die. But there's a difference between being brave and being a coward. Between Ren and me, I had watched Ren die with his head held high, and I thought I could follow in his footsteps. But now my eyes darted around, and my palms grew slick with sweat. Father stood in the corner, sharpening his blade, knowing that knife would slice through my flesh and turn me into salty chicken. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't brave. I wasn't like Ren, or Becca, or Jonas. I was a coward. And I wasn't going to die. Suddenly, the world sped up. My body moved on instinct. Into breaths, one to reach the door, and the next to twist the handle. I was outside, sprinting through the tunnels. The hunt began the moment I bolted from what I had called home. The others never ran. They gave themselves up. But cowards were free game. I ran as fast as my legs would take me, my mind spinning. The others were already chasing me. The rules were simple. Cowards who tried to escape were caught, dragged back, and skinned alive. But going back was suicide. Father had always been strict about the rules. We were not allowed to leave the bunker. Out in the tunnels, bounty hunters and reformed kids, brainwashed into serving adults, searched for those of us who had escaped. Yet as I threw myself deeper into the darkness, ankle deep in sewage, I saw no hunters. "Vivi," Jack's voice echoed behind me, making me stumble for a second. "Vivi, come back. It's not safe." His footsteps hesitated as we neared the sliver of light peeking through a crack in the ceiling. I could sense his fear of the unknown, of what lay beyond the bunker. Then something flashed silver in the darkness. Ren's voice echoed in my mind. "I saw it, Vivi. When I was on lookout with Jonas, we found a ladder. We can climb out of here." His voice had been so hopeful, so full of life. My chest tightened as I gripped the ladder and started to climb. Clawing my way up, the light grew brighter. Not the eerie red glow Father had described, but something pure, clean. Father had always told us the sky was tainted with pollution, stained a sickly red. He said when the world fell apart, the nuclear power plants went into meltdown, covering everything in poison. But as I climbed through the metal grating and emerged above ground, blinking in the sunlight, I realized Father had lied. The sky wasn't red dot, it was a bright, perfect blue. Suddenly, a rush of fumes filled my nose as something sped past me, and a deep voice yelled, "Kid, what are you doing in the middle of the road?" I looked around, panicked, and ducked back into the shadows, my heart pounding. The world was not what I had expected. I had climbed up into the middle of a road. Cars zoomed past me, and I realized the world wasn't the barren wasteland Father had described. "Hey, are you okay?" Another voice, softer this time. I turned to see a boy about my age, standing over me. He wasn't like the others from the bunker. His outfit threw me off. He wore a white shirt, jeans, and a leather jacket casually flung over his shoulder. His hair was a vibrant red, styled in a way I had never seen before. He didn't look like a prisoner. His brown eyes looked kind. And in his hand, he held a small, rectangular device I had never seen before. Cell phone. Father had told us that phones were used as currency in the New World, traded like gold. Yet here was this boy, holding one casually like it meant nothing, his thumb swiping lazily across the screen. He didn't look like someone fighting to survive. He looked like any normal college kid, fresh-faced and carefree, as if he didn't have to worry about the horrors I had been conditioned to expect. His eyes were bright, alive, not hollow and empty like Ren's had been in his final moments, or like Jack's, filled with fear and guilt. For a second, I was stunned by the brightness of it all, the harsh blaring of car horns, the warmth of the sun beating down on the back of my neck. My whole life, I had been taught the sun was buried beneath layers of smog, that the air was toxic, that blue skies were a thing of the past. But everything Father had told us was a lie. I focused on the stranger again, taking in his appearance, and one glaring detail stood out. He wasn't starving. His skin wasn't stretched tight over his bones like Jack's. He wasn't weak or malnourished like the others back in the bunker. He was healthy. He was alive in a way that I had never thought was possible. Seeing that, seeing people living ordinary lives, not suffering, not fearing for their survival, it filled me with something like joy. But it was short-lived, the happiness quickly drowned by despair as the taste of Ren's flesh returned to my mouth. My stomach heaved, and suddenly I was on all fours, dry heaving onto the pavement, tears streaming down my face. I was crying, screaming even, though I barely recognized the sounds coming out of me. I couldn't think. I couldn't process anything but the overwhelming nausea and the taste of my best friend on my lips. I barely registered when the boy knelt down next to me, his voice laced with panic. Double quotes, "Hey, are you okay? Oh God, did you just crawl out of the ground?" His voice was frantic, each word rushing out faster than the last. "Shit, okay, let's get you to the emergency room. You're gonna be fine." I heard someone shout across the street, asking if I was okay, but their words didn't reach me. My world was fragmenting, collapsing in on itself. Father's lies were unraveling in my mind. Everything he had ever told me about the sky, the world, the adults, was crumbling. The sky wasn't red. My generation wasn't being hunted. Adults weren't monsters. And I was safe. For the first time in my life, I was safe, pressed against the cool leather of the car seat. I curled into myself, struggling to breathe. The boy, the stranger, was driving, the engine humming softly beneath me, and I was still trying to wrap my head around what I had just learned. "Sue, what's your name?" the boy asked, his voice more relaxed now that we were moving. "Do you sit in the middle of the road often, or is that like a TikTok thing?" He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, clearly curious but hesitant to bombard me with questions. I couldn't answer him. I stared out the window, watching as the world moved around me, cars passing by, people walking on sidewalks, a mother pushing a stroller with her baby inside. Tears stung my eyes. It was also normal. The boy fiddled with his phone, and a song started playing through the car's speakers. I didn't recognize the tune, but the rhythmic beat soothed me, pushing back some of the darker thoughts clouding my mind. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me, and for the first time since I escaped the bunker, I felt a sliver of calm. Under the warm afternoon sun, I finally took a good look at the boy's face. He had freckles, just like Ren used to. "Do you, need me to take you home or something?" he asked, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Or maybe to the sheriff's office. You kinda look like you've been through some stuff." His eyes flicked to my clothes, the torn, dirty remains of my bunker uniform. I didn't need to look down to know what he was seeing. My shirt was stained with blood. Ren's blood. But he didn't ask about it. Instead, he handed me a canned soda. I stared at it for a second, my brain trying to catch up. Real soda was a luxury in the bunker. The only time we had it was when Father found a stash of expired, lukewarm cans of Diet Cola. But this was fresh, cold. I gulped it down quickly, the sugary fizz shocking my senses. The boy laughed. "Well, slow down. You're gonna choke." I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, embarrassed. "Sorry. No need to apologize." He glanced over at me with a smile. "Where do you live? I can take you home if you want. Or at least somewhere safe. I'm Jordan, by the way. Vivi. Cool name like Nefertari Vivi." His eyes lit up with recognition, but when I didn't respond, he chuckled nervously. "Okay, maybe not an One Piece fan, huh?" I couldn't find the words to respond. I could barely breathe. Father had lied about everything. Relief washed over me, warm and real. I didn't have to die. My eyes fluttered, my head bouncing against the glass of the window. Outside, the streets were alive with movement. Kids were everywhere, laughing and playing, and my heart sang at the sight. As we drove past what I guessed was a high school, I noticed the windows had been blown out, trash scattered across the campus. But then, another high school came into view, and through looming metal gates, I saw them kids, alive and free. "Hey, can I talk to Blue?" Jordan's murmur brought me back to reality. "Sir?" came a voice through the device clipped to his ear. He sighed. "Yes, I've got one of them." I sensed a shift in the mood, tension creeping into the air. Jordan leaned back in his chair, the seat squeaking beneath him. "Yeah, no, I'm not stupid. 500. You tell me where my brother is. We had a deal." I caught movement as he leaned away, frustration lining his features. "No. Tell me where Ryan is, and it's yours." "The 500 means nothing to me, asshole." My eyelids grew heavy, and I think I dozed off, my head still awkwardly pressed against the pane. When I woke, the atmosphere had shifted. Jordan was arguing, his voice raised. "Oh, come on. I wasn't even going that fast." The sun had disappeared, the late afternoon giving way to twilight. I had never seen the night sky, nor the stars or the sliver of the moon hanging low on the horizon. A figure outside the window was illuminated by floodlights, an adult. I stiffened at the sight, the memories of Father's warnings flooding back. But then I remembered. Adults weren't hunting us down. Father was. I was very clear, Jordan. The woman's voice grated on my ears, sharp and commanding. If I caught you speeding again, I would report you. Yes, Miss Carter. Jordan's tone dripped with sarcasm. I'm aware I was maybe possibly definitely speeding. But as you can see, he gestured at me with flailing hands, this girl is clearly distressed, and I'm taking her to the sheriff's office. Jordan pulled out a piece of paper from under his seat. I have a license right here. I can see that, she replied curtly. He whistled in exasperation. All right. Well, I'll be on my way. Mr. Redbird, if you so much as touch that steering wheel, I will report you. But, the woman cleared her throat, her patience wearing thin. I can take it from here. Jordan's expression darkened, his smile fading. I said, I've got it. Hand over the girl. And I won't say a word about your speeding. The boy scoffed, revealing a defiant side I hadn't seen before. She's all yours, he said, but to my surprise, he didn't move or speak when Miss Carter gently grasped my arm, coaxing me from the seat. As the door slammed shut behind me, I felt a pang of loss at Jordan's sudden departure. She wasn't finished with him yet. Are you chewing, Jordan? He shrugged nonchalantly. What, I can't chew and drive? The woman didn't respond, her gaze sharp and scrutinizing. He exhaled an exaggerated sigh and opened his mouth, revealing a piece of gum. To my confusion, she plucked it from his fingers with a handkerchief. Thank you, she said coolly. He rolled his eyes. You're welcome. Have fun. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the back of the car, startling me. Miss Carter shot Jordan an accusatory glare, and for a brief moment, I saw the cracks in his bravado. Just go, he snapped, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. As I stood there, torn between two worlds, I realized that I had crossed a line into the unknown. I had escaped the bunker, but now, what awaited me in this new reality? Car trouble, Mr. Redbird. Jordan glanced at me, a smile tugging at his lips, as another unmistakable bang echoed from the back, this time louder. Yep. Car trouble, ma'am. His smile had too many teeth. Have a great night. With a two-fingered salute, he drove off, leaving me engulfed in a cloud of exhaust fumes. 3 hours later, I found myself in a comfy chair in the sheriff's office, a towel wrapped around my shoulders. Miss Carter sat in front of me, the glare from her laptop screen casting shadows under her eyes. Tell me everything, she instructed. So I did, spilling out my entire life story, every horrific detail about the bunker, my father, and Wren. Miss Carter paused to hand me a tissue when I realized I was crying, swiping at my nose in disbelief. She was surprisingly gentle, offering me drinks and microwave noodles to eat. According to her, I was on the verge of adulthood in this town. While they tracked down my parents, she offered me a place at a boarding house for grown-ups like me, orphans of the New World. Halfway through recounting my memories of Wren, she asked for the tissue I had used. I handed it over, and she offered a fresh one before jumping to her feet. I'm just going to process your details in the system, she said, her smile kind. I wasn't used to kindness. I'll be right back. Those words twisted my gut, bringing back memories of my mother's promise before father had taken me away. Miss Carter, she told me to call her Linda, was gone for a while, and I found myself alone in her cozy office. I slumped in my spinning chair, tempted to sleep, but the laptop left for me to play with caught my eye. The first thing I did was check out the internet. There was no disaster, just like our town. The world continued on as normal. As I scrolled through online news articles, a wave of nausea hit me. I wasn't used to normal food. let alone normal life. In search of a bathroom, I stumbled upon another office. I could see Linda through the window, something pressed to her face. At first, I thought she had a nosebleed. Then I saw the creases in the tissue, and realization washed over me. It was my tissue. I felt myself back away slowly, dread creeping into my veins. Linda was trembling, slamming the tissue against her nose and mouth, inhaling it like a drug. Like me, just like father said. He claimed we were a black market drug to them. I only managed to gather my thoughts when she dropped the tissue, reaching into her jeans pocket and pulling out something. Jordan's used gum. The sticky wad was wrapped around her fingers, and when she popped it into her mouth, I remembered how to run. Her mouth opened wider and wider, an inky void of darkness chasing after me. I bolted, escaping out of the office and straight into Jordan. He didn't look fazed by my expression. "Let me guess," he said, leaning against the doorframe with arms folded. I had no idea how he had casually walked into a sheriff's office. Jordan tilted his head, revealing that haunted emptiness in his eyes, the eyes of a thread. "Miss Carter just tried to eat you, didn't she?" In my panic, I tried to slip past him, but he sidestepped to block my way. "I can help you," he said. "I was trying to help earlier, but you were kidnapped." Before I could respond, his expression darkened. "You can either come with me, or become a main course." His gaze flicked to my blood-stained shirt. "Your choice." I hesitated, torn between instinct and reason. Part of me wanted to trust him, but the banging from his truck replayed in my mind. Shoving past him, I sprinted away until I was gasping for breath. Over the last few days, I had been hiding. I swiped a phone from an adult, and thankfully, it had internet access. A car passed by every day and night. I knew it was Jordan's. But he was a thread. Why would he hunt down other threads? I couldn't stop shaking. Father had lied about everything, but maybe he hadn't lied about this town. The outside world appeared normal, but New Haven was something else entirely. The adults here felt like monsters in disguise. So, if you are a kid in New Haven, please help me. The adults in my town wear human faces but are far from human. If you are an adult, I have a gun, and I will shoot you. My name is Amanda, and I've always had a passion for hairdressing. It's something I've been fascinated with for as long as I can remember. So, when I got a job offer at a local salon last week, I was thrilled. What better way to sharpen my skills than by working in a professional environment? On the day of my interview, I noticed something odd. Nearly all of the employees were missing their front teeth. The receptionist, the hairdressers, even the cleaning staff, they all smiled with noticeable gaps where their front teeth should have been. There was, however, one new employee who still had hers. She had just started that very same day, but at the time, I didn't think much of it. "You'll begin next Monday, Amanda. We're excited to have you," my new employer had said, his voice full of enthusiasm. I was introduced to the staff before I left, and I couldn't wait for Monday to come. When the day arrived, I walked into the salon feeling nervous but eager to start. The boss was an elusive figure, always holed up in his office or out of the building. He rarely interacted with the staff, which struck me as strange, but I was too focused on my work to dwell on it. As the day progressed, something unsettling happened. A man wearing a black tuxedo, holding a bright red briefcase, walked into the salon. The air in the room seemed to change as he entered, like a storm had just passed through. There was something off about him, something that made me feel uneasy. "Who is that?" I whispered to one of the employees. "That's the boss's business partner," she replied, keeping her voice low. The man went straight into the boss's office and didn't come out for an entire hour. When he finally emerged, the red briefcase was gone. The next morning, the new hairdresser, the one who had all her teeth, came in, but something was different about her. Her front teeth were missing. It was bizarre. She hadn't mentioned any accidents or dental issues the day before. "What happened to your teeth?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice light. She seemed confused. "I don't know," she replied. "I just woke up, and they were gone. I can't even find where they fell out." Her answer sent a chill down my spine. How could someone lose their teeth without knowing how or where it happened? It didn't make any sense. Still, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe she'd had a wild night out or something. But as the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The following week, as I was working with a client, that same man in the black tuxedo appeared again. This time, he carried the same red briefcase. Our eyes locked for a moment before he entered the boss's office. After an hour, he left, again without the briefcase. The entire situation was getting under my skin. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to that man, the briefcase, and the missing teeth. I could barely sleep that night. The pieces just didn't add up. The next morning, one of the cleaning ladies greeted me, but I immediately noticed something was wrong. Her teeth, which had been perfectly fine the day before, now looked decayed. They were brown, almost black, and looked like they were rotting from the inside out. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something was definitely wrong at that salon, and it had everything to do with that man and his briefcase. My suspicions grew even stronger when the man returned yet again to retrieve the briefcase. After exactly an hour in the boss's office, he left with it. The day after, I walked into the salon and found that the cleaning lady's decayed teeth were gone. Just like the others, her front teeth had disappeared overnight. That was it for me. I had to leave before whatever was happening claimed my teeth next. I decided to confront my boss and resign, but just as I was about to knock on his office door, the man with the briefcase arrived again. I couldn't go through with it. His presence unnerved me too much. I knew my boss was somehow involved. He was using his employees' teeth for something, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. I went home, determined to resign the following day, but when I woke up the next morning, something horrifying had happened. My front teeth were gone. Just like everyone else, they had disappeared overnight, and I had no idea where they went. Panicked, I rushed to the salon, covering my mouth with a mask. I had to confront my boss. I had to quit. As I entered the salon, the man with the red briefcase was leaving. I watched in horror as he walked out, knowing without a doubt that my teeth were inside that briefcase. I never did get the chance to speak to my boss. I quit that day, but the damage was already done. Who knows whose teeth will be next? So last week, one of my best friends, Jonah, went missing. Jonah was blind, and it still doesn't feel real that he's gone. I've talked to his family, reported everything to the police, but nothing's been uncovered. I'm hoping that sharing this on the internet will help in some way. Jonah kept an audio diary, recording his thoughts, and it was up to date until the day he disappeared. Below is what I managed to transcribe from his last recording. Hey ... I need to get today's events down for the record, in case I need to show it to the police. Something attacked me today. I'm not sure what it was, but it attacked me. It started when I got home from a day trip with a buddy of mine. I walked into my apartment, the familiar sounds and smells calming me as usual. I went to put my handbag on the chair near the front door, same place I always put it, but instead of the quiet thud of the bag hitting the chair, I heard it hit the floor instead. That's when a wave of dread washed over me. Something was in my apartment. I took a step forward and heard loud, slapping footsteps coming from the far end of the room, near the hallway that leads to the bathroom. Whatever it was, it snorted, kind of like a pig, but something felt wrong, like it wasn't really a pig. My hand moved to the left of the door where I keep my umbrellas. That's also where a friend of mine left a baseball bat for me. Holding the bat in my hands brought me some relief. I had to remind myself that, whatever it wasn't an animal. No, it was something else. I moved cautiously through the living room, but I tripped. The coffee table wasn't where it should have been. The noise caused the creature to make a gurgling grunt, and then it ran out of the hallway, heading toward me. I swung the bat blindly, desperate. The bat connected with something solid. The impact jolted my arm so hard, I thought I'd hit a wall. That's when I realized the thing was standing right in front of me. I could feel the heat and sweat radiating from its body, towering over me, much too tall for a pig. Its breath was hot and foul, blowing against my forehead. For what felt like an eternity, it just stood there, its bones popping and throat gurgling. Then, without warning, something heavy slammed into my stomach, knocking me to the ground. My back hit hard, and I reflexively put my hands out to stop my fall, but pain shot through my left wrist. Before I could react, a heavy, sweaty column of flesh landed on my chest. I grabbed at it with both hands, but it was too slick with sweat, and my hands slipped off. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, so I grabbed again, this time managing to get a grip on its skin. The skin tore right off in my hands. The creature screamed, a horrible sound that rattled my bones. But I didn't stop. I kept tearing at its flesh, pulling off strips of skin. Hot liquid poured over me, and its screeches grew louder and more desperate. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the creature pulled away. I gasped for air, my lungs burning. I heard something heavy hit the floor, but I didn't stop to think. I crawled away, desperate to get as far from it as possible. I could hear it moving, crashing through the back door. It was gone. I'm safe ... for now. I crawled back to my bag, fumbling for the emergency lifeline I keep on my keys, the one that contacts the hospital directly. That's where I am now, leaning against the wall, just waiting. I wanted to say what happened while I still can. I don't know if anyone will believe me. That was the last recording Jonah made before he disappeared. I don't know what to think of it. The police have no leads, and no one seems to believe this story. But I do. Something attacked Jonah. I just hope sharing this helps in some way. Please, if anyone has any information or thoughts on what could have happened to Jonah. I ran back down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The oppressive silence of the basement felt like it was closing in on me. I called out for Mike again, this time louder, desperate for a response. The flashlight beam flickered across the rough stone walls, casting long shadows that danced ominously. "Mike!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the cold, damp walls. There was still no answer. The growing sense of dread made my skin crawl. I stepped further into the basement, shining the light into every corner, every dark alcove. Just as I was about to turn back upstairs, something caught my eye. There, at the far end of the basement, near an old wooden support beam, I saw a movement. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. A shadow shifted, just for a moment, and then it was gone. "Mike!" I yelled again, my voice laced with panic. This time, the silence that followed felt heavier, more suffocating. I decided to approach the spot where I'd seen the movement. As I crept closer, the flashlight beam illuminated the ground, revealing nothing but dust and scattered debris. The cold air wrapped around me like a damp shroud, and I shivered, not just from the temperature but from an inexplicable sense of dread. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It sounded like my name, John. It sent chills racing down my spine. I turned abruptly, shining the flashlight around, but there was no one there. I was alone in this dark, cold tomb of a basement. Panic surged again, and I sprinted back toward the stairs, desperate to escape the growing sense of foreboding. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing there, just inside the doorway, was Mike. He looked pale and disoriented, as if he'd just woken from a deep sleep. "Mike, where were you? I thought something happened," I exclaimed, my heart still racing. He blinked at me, confusion clouding his eyes. I don't know. One minute I was just standing here, and then... It's like I lost time." He rubbed his temples, as if trying to clear his head. "I swear, I thought I heard you calling me, but I couldn't respond." My gut twisted at his words. "You didn't hear me yelling for you?" I was terrified. "I thought you were gone." "I'm sorry, man," he said, shaking his head. I don't know what happened." He glanced around the basement, a shiver running down his spine. "It feels strange down here." I nodded in agreement, the oppressive atmosphere heavy around us. "Yeah, it feels wrong. Like something is watching us." "Let's just get out of here," Mike suggested, his voice tight. I didn't argue. As we made our way up the creaky stairs, the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to leave the sanctuary of the basement. Once we reached the living room, I flipped on the lights, illuminating the space with a harsh glow. It felt like a safety net, but I couldn't shake the dread that had settled deep in my bones. Mike sank into the couch, visibly shaken. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear that clung to me. "No, not really. Just some weird stuff happening, I guess." But deep down, I felt the weight of uncertainty. This wasn't just a strange occurrence. Something was off. We cracked open a couple of beers, attempting to ease the tension, but the atmosphere remained thick with unease. We talked about mundane things, sports, work, but my mind kept drifting back to the basement and the chilling whispers. As the night wore on, Mike finally suggested we head to bed. I didn't argue. I was exhausted, but sleep felt like a distant hope. I wanted nothing more than to forget the strange encounter, but as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could still feel that oppressive darkness creeping closer. Eventually, sleep took me, but it was restless and fraught with nightmares. I dreamt of shadows moving just outside my window, of whispers calling my name. When I awoke, the sun was shining through the curtains, but the feeling of dread hadn't left me. After Mike left the next day, I tried to push the memories of the night before aside. I spent the next few days unpacking and settling in, hoping to distract myself from the dark thoughts. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the corners of the house, waiting for me to let my guard down. The basement, once a cool refuge, had transformed into a source of fear. I avoided it as much as possible, opting to store things elsewhere. But every time I passed the door, I felt the urge to check on it, to confront whatever had taken hold of that space. One evening, feeling bold, I decided to venture down once more. Armed with my flashlight, I descended the stairs, determined to face my fears. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I steeled myself as I stepped inside. I scanned the room, heart pounding in my chest. Everything looked normal. Dusty boxes stacked against the walls, the same old stonework, but something felt different, almost charged. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to explore, pushing past the shadowy corners that had haunted my mind. As I rummaged through the boxes, a sudden cold gust of wind rushed through the basement, making me shiver. I turned quickly, the flashlight flickering, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, barely perceptible, lingering in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and though the wolf didn't return, the unease remained. Each night, I found myself leaving offerings at the edge of the property, small tokens of peace, hoping to appease whatever force lurked in the shadows. A deer's heart here, a few feathers there. I had to believe that something could bridge the gap between us, that maybe, just maybe, I could coexist with the mystery that surrounded our home. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I was jolted awake by a commotion outside. The dogs were barking wildly, their frantic sounds echoing through the stillness. I rushed to the window, peering into the darkness. There, at the edge of the woods, I saw it, two sets of glowing eyes, one yellow, the other a haunting blue, both watching me intently. My heart dropped as the reality of the situation set in. The black wolf hadn't forgotten me, and it was back, this time with company. Panic surged through me as I read the note. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My wife was out there, driving through those dark woods, looking for me. I couldn't let her go alone, not after what I'd just experienced. I hurried to grab my jacket and slipped on my shoes. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. I grabbed my phone, hoping it would work this time. I dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustration mounted. I couldn't waste any more time. I rushed outside and jumped into my truck. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the driveway, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The familiar route felt foreign and threatening now. Every shadow flickered with the memory of those yellow eyes, and the chilling cries echoed in my mind. I had to find her. As I approached the entrance to the shortcut, I slowed down, scanning the tree line for any signs of her vehicle. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a suffocating blanket. The moon struggled to break through the dense clouds, casting an unsettling gloom over the path ahead. I turned onto the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Each sound, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the darkness. No response. I parked the truck and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin. I listened intently, straining to hear anything, her voice, the sound of a car door, anything. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering, not far off. My heart dropped. It sounded like a child. I sprinted towards the sound, hoping against hope it was her. As I pushed through the underbrush, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rancid. "No," I blurted, panic rising in my throat. I'm not crazy, Stacy. I'm telling you the truth. He was here, in this house. He helped me move in. I swear, I'm not making this up. She hesitated, looking at me like I was some sort of puzzle she couldn't solve. Let me see inside, she said quietly. Maybe there's something that can help clear this up. I nodded, swallowing hard, and led her inside. The house was just as I had left it. Boxes half unpacked, beer bottles from the night Mike was here. But as we walked through the rooms, everything felt off. Like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. We made our way to the basement door, and I stopped, staring at the handle. The memory of that night with Mike, the shadows, the whispers, it all flooded back, and my hand trembled as I reached for the knob. Brett. Stacy's voice was soft, cautious. I glanced at her, then turned the knob and opened the door. A rush of cold air greeted us as we descended the stairs. I flicked on the flashlight again, the same one I'd used when I went searching for Mike. The dim beam of light flickered over the stone walls, and for a moment I thought I saw something shift in the darkness. Stacy shivered as she stepped off the last stair, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's freezing down here," she whispered. I nodded, scanning the room. Everything looked the same, boxes stacked against the walls, the same old stonework, but there was something about the space that felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it had something to do with Mike's disappearance. "Look, over there." I pointed to where we'd been drinking the night Mike disappeared. We were sitting right there, and then he was just gone. Stacy walked over to the spot, frowning. "This is weird, Brett. I don't feel right being down here." "Neither do I admitted. "But he vanished from this room, Stacy. He didn't go upstairs, didn't leave the house. He was just gone." Suddenly, there was a soft creak from behind us. We both whipped around, and my flashlight flickered again. The air seemed to grow colder, and a low hum filled the room, like distant voices, just out of reach. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Stacy nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "We need to get out of here." We rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. The moment we were back in the living room, Stacy turned to me, her face pale. "Something's wrong with this place, Brett. I don't know what's going on, but you need to leave. You can't stay here." I wanted to argue, to tell her I wasn't going anywhere, but deep down, I knew she was right. Something unnatural was happening in that house, something I couldn't explain. "I'll leave," I promised. "But I need to find out what happened to Mike first." She stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "Okay, but promise me you'll be careful." "This doesn't feel right," I agreed. But as I watched her drive away, a gnawing fear settled in my gut. Whatever was happening in that house, it wasn't finished with me yet. In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece my life back together, though that was no easy feat. It felt like I was living in a dream, or more like a nightmare, that I couldn't wake up from. I left the house and moved into a cramped apartment across town, far away from the basement that had haunted my nights. Far away from Mike's car that no longer sat in my driveway, and far away from any hope of seeing Stacy again. I spent most of my days avoiding people. Every interaction felt tainted with a fear that I couldn't explain, a fear that, at any moment, someone else in my life might simply vanish like they had never existed. I withdrew, cutting off old friends and dodging their questions about Mike or Stacy. A few weeks later, curiosity got the best of me. I had to know if anyone had heard from Mike. His family never called, but I hadn't exactly been proactive in reaching out to them. It felt like whatever had happened to him had been erased from everyone's memory, except mine. I drove past Mike's old house one evening, hoping for some kind of normalcy, but his car wasn't there. His parents' house looked exactly the same, except for the for sale sign planted in the front yard. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it, heart racing. How could this be? Mike's family had lived there for decades. Had they moved out without any warning? The next day, I visited the real estate office to ask about the house. I pretended to be a potential buyer and inquired about the property. The agent looked at me with a blank expression when I mentioned Mike's family. "Oh, the Jones house. That's been on the market for a few months now," she said, flipping through her files. "The owners moved to Florida last summer. No one named Mike lived there, though. Are you sure you've got the right place?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Moved last summer. I had been at that house with Mike only weeks ago. None of this made sense. I felt like I was losing my mind. It was then that I realized something much deeper was at play. Something that was beyond me. I wasn't just losing friends, they were being erased. Their very existence wiped clean from the memories of everyone around me. And I was the only one left to remember. I went back to my apartment and spent hours poring over old photos, hoping for some proof, anything to confirm that I wasn't going insane. But as I flipped through picture after picture, I noticed something horrifying. Mike wasn't in any of them. Group photos, high school events, camping trips, he was gone, erased, like he had never been there in the first place. Panicked, I tried to call other friends who had known him, but they all acted like I was speaking gibberish. "Mike who?" they'd ask, their voices laced with confusion. It was the same with Stacy. No one had any memory of them. It was as if they had been wiped from existence. And with each call, I felt myself slipping further into a dark abyss, helpless against the forces that had claimed them. I spent the next few nights in a sleepless daze, afraid that if I let myself drift off, I might wake up to find that more people had vanished from my life. Maybe even more horrifying, I feared that I would be next, that one day I too would simply cease to exist. Then one night, as I sat staring blankly at my wall, I heard a knock at the door. It was a soft knock, hesitant, almost like someone didn't want to disturb me but felt compelled to. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached the door, dread pooling in my stomach. I opened it slowly, not knowing what or who to expect. No one was there. I stepped outside, glancing up and down the empty hallway of my apartment building. But as I stood there, I noticed something on the ground, just in front of my door. A gold necklace, shimmering under the dim hallway light. Stacy's necklace. My breath caught in my throat. How was this possible? I had held that necklace the night she disappeared. I had rubbed the edges of the cross between my fingers until I fell asleep. And now it was here, lying at my doorstep, as if she had just been there. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and something inside me snapped. I didn't know what to believe anymore, whether my memories were real, whether my friends had ever existed, whether I was still sane. But one thing was clear: someone, or something, wanted me to remember them. The next morning, I packed a small bag and left the apartment. I had no destination in mind, no plan. I just needed to get away. Away from the house, away from the town, away from the memories that no one else seemed to share. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I knew that whatever had taken Mike and Stacy wasn't finished with me yet. As I drove away, I glanced at the necklace on the seat beside me. It glinted in the sunlight, a haunting reminder of everything I had lost. And though I tried to shake the feeling, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Whatever had taken them, whatever force had erased their existence from the world, was still up there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me too. That was when I knew things were moving too fast. Jack had always been impulsive, but this felt like something else. Still, I bit my tongue, not wanting to rain on his excitement. I figured we could handle one guest, just to dip our toes in the water. How bad could it be? The next day, our first guest arrived. His name was Mr. Halvorsen, a quiet, middle-aged man with a thick Scandinavian accent. He didn't say much as Jack showed him around, just nodded politely and asked for his room key. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, though too fluid, like his joints weren't connected the way they should be. I tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to nerves about hosting our first guest. That night, the air in the hotel felt thick, like something unseen was pressing down on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. Even Jack seemed more subdued than usual, sitting silently in the corner of our makeshift living room, scrolling through his phone. We went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise like scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I strained to listen, it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Then, I heard footsteps creaking in the hallway outside our room, slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, hoping it was just Jack getting up for a drink of water, but I could still feel his body lying next to mine. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I felt paralyzed, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, listening for any further movement. But there was nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to whisper, "Jack." "Did you hear that?" He groaned softly and rolled over, still half asleep. "It's an old building. Leave. You know how these places creak and groan. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. My skin prickled with an unnatural tension, like I was being watched by unseen eyes. I lay there, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found Jack already up, sipping coffee and reviewing our financials at the kitchen table. I poured myself a cup, still shaken by the night before. "Did you check on Mr. Halvorsen this morning?" I asked. He seemed off when he checked in. Jack looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. I knocked on his door, but he didn't answer. I figured he might have gone for a walk. Why, I hesitated. I just ... I heard something strange last night, like someone walking outside our room. It freaked me out a little. Jack chuckled and shook his head. "Leave. You're just spooking yourself. You know how your imagination runs wild in places like this." I'm sure it was nothing. I wanted to believe him, but something didn't sit right with me. After breakfast, I decided to go check on Mr. Halvorsen myself. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time, but still nothing. Finally, I tried the handle. It wasn't locked. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside the room. The air was musty and cold, far colder than the rest of the hotel. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. The bed was neatly made. The suitcase was still in the corner, untouched. But Mr. Halvorsen was nowhere to be found. I checked the bathroom, but it was empty. A sense of unease crept up my spine. His car was still parked out front, so he hadn't left. But there was no sign of him anywhere. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I noticed something odd on the nightstand. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, expecting to find some travel notes or a journal. But the pages were covered in strange symbols, jagged, twisted lines that looked more like scratches than writing. I couldn't make sense of any of it. That's when I noticed the smell, faint but unmistakable. A sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit, mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned as the scent grew stronger, filling the room. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further, and the lights flickered. I heard a low, guttural whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of the room, where shadows seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly pale, stepped out of the shadows. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. It moved toward me slowly, almost lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. I screamed, dropping the notebook as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My legs shook as I stumbled down the hallway, calling for Jack. He came running, concern etched on his face. "What happened?" he asked, grabbing my arms. I could barely form the words. He's gone. Mr. Halvorsen. He's gone. And there's something in his room." Jack looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Leave, slow down. What are you talking about?" I grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the room. But when we opened the door again, it was empty. The smell was gone, the temperature back to normal. The notebook was still on the nightstand, but the strange symbols were no longer there, just blank pages. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "Leave, I think you're just stressed. Maybe you should take a break. We've been pushing ourselves pretty hard lately." I didn't argue. I didn't know what else to say, but I knew what I had seen. And I knew deep down that something was very, very wrong with the old Willowbrook Hotel. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear the whispers again, growing louder with each passing hour. Jack doesn't believe me. He's still convinced it's all in my head. But I know the truth. We never should have come here. Please, if you're reading this, stay far away from the old Willowbrook Hotel. There are things here that should never be disturbed. And once they've found you, they'll never let you go. A chill ran down my spine as those words echoed from the other side of the door. Jack froze, his hand still on the handle, wide-eyed and uncertain. We hadn't hired any workers that night, and no one was supposed to be inside room 113. It was still under heavy renovation, unfinished, and locked to everyone. "Jack," I whispered, my voice barely audible, that sounded like a child. He didn't respond, just stood there, gripping the doorknob as if unsure whether to open it or bolt the other way. The whimpering started again, more desperate this time. My heart ached. Whoever was in there needed help. But something deep inside warned me. "Do not open that door. We have to check," Jack finally muttered, sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than me. He turned the handle slowly, the old metal squealing in protest. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, unfinished room. Dust particles floated in the air, and broken beams and wires hung down from the ceiling. But as Jack flipped the light switch, the bulb overhead flickered dimly, casting weak, yellow light over the space. It was empty. No workers. No child. Just the bones of the hotel that we hadn't yet brought to life. "I heard it, too," Jack whispered, scanning the room. His voice was shaky, his usual confidence stripped away. There was definitely someone. Jack, let's just leave, I urged, backing away. Maybe it's an animal or something. We can check it out in the morning. He hesitated, and I saw the doubt in his eyes. But before he could respond, there was a soft click from behind us. The door to room 217 swung shut. A quiet, deliberate sound, as though someone had gently closed it. Both of us turned in unison, staring at the hallway. The tension in the air was palpable, like we were being watched. But by what? Or by whom? Suddenly, footsteps echoed from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps that moved with a steady rhythm down the hall directly above us. It sounded like someone wearing boots, someone far too large to be a child. Jack motioned for me to stay quiet as we crept up the stairs, the sound growing louder with every step we took. The footsteps stopped just before we reached the landing. I gripped Jack's arm tightly. "What are we doing? We should call the police." "There's someone in here with us." But Jack shook his head. "No signal out here. Remember, we're too far in the woods." His eyes darted around nervously. "Besides, it's probably just Mr. Smith. Maybe he heard the same thing and came to check it out." But as we reached the top of the stairs, we found the hallway completely empty. The air was thick, oppressive, and the old wallpaper seemed to ripple in the dim light. "Mr. Smith," Jack called out cautiously. No answer. Just silence. I clutched his arm tighter. "Let's go back to our room. We'll lock the door, wait until daylight, and figure it out then." But before Jack could reply, the lights above us flickered again and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. My breath hitched in my throat. The air around us grew colder, and I swore I could feel the walls closing in. And then, out of the silence, came a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." It was a woman's voice, soft and dripping with malice. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, my body frozen in place. Jack grabbed my hand. "Run," he hissed. We bolted down the hall, stumbling blindly through the darkness, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet, as though the hotel itself was alive, shifting beneath us. I could hear the whispers growing louder, surrounding us, filling my ears until I could barely think straight. We reached our room and slammed the door behind us, Jack locking it and pushing a dresser in front for good measure. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my pulse racing. I looked at Jack, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" I whispered. "What the hell is happening in this place?" Jack shook his head, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. First thing in the morning." I wanted to believe we could just leave, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something in this hotel didn't want us to leave. Something had been waiting, lurking, and now that we were here, it wasn't going to let us go so easily. The rest of the night passed in eerie silence, though I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, hollow eyes staring at me, felt the cold presence of something in the room with us. By dawn, Jack had packed our bags, his face set in grim determination. We didn't speak much, just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. As we loaded the last of our things into the car, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Smith standing in the lobby, watching us with that unsettling smile. "I hope your stay was illuminating," he said, his voice like silk. Jack didn't respond, just slammed the car door shut. I forced a tight smile and nodded, eager to put as much distance between us and that hotel as possible. But just before I turned to leave, Mr. Smith's eyes locked onto mine. "You'll be back," he said softly. "They always come back. His words echoed in my mind as we sped down the winding road, the old Willowbrook Hotel disappearing behind the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever we had disturbed in that place wasn't finished with us yet. And as we reached the edge of town, Jack's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the old Willowbrook Hotel. The subject line simply read, "Room 217 is ready for your return." Jack and I exchanged horrified glances. There shouldn't be anyone in that room, let alone a child. "We're coming in," Jack said, turning the handle. The door swung open with a creak, revealing nothing. The room was empty, dusty furniture covered in drop cloths. No sign of a child or anyone else. "What the hell is going on?" Jack muttered. I was about to respond when something caught my eye. On the far wall, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight, was a series of scratch marks. As I moved closer, I realized they formed words. "Don't let him stay." My blood ran cold. "Jack," I whispered, "we need to get out of here. Now." He nodded, face ashen. "Yeah, okay, let's just grab some clothes," and a scream from upstairs cut him off. But this time, it wasn't the strange, otherworldly shriek we'd heard before. It was Mr. Smith. We raced back upstairs, all thoughts of leaving forgotten. The door to room 217 was wide open now, and the sounds coming from inside made my stomach churn. Wet, ripping noises, like something being torn apart. "Mr. Smith," Jack called out as we approached the doorway. The noises stopped. We peered into the room, and I had to clap a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Mr. Smith stood in the center of the room, his back to us. But it wasn't Mr. Smith anymore. His suit was in tatters, revealing gray, mottled skin underneath. And his head. Oh God, his head was twisted completely backward, his gray eyes staring at us over his own shoulder. He smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "I'm so glad you could join us," the thing that used to be Mr. Smith said. "The others have been waiting for so long." As if on cue, shadows began to peel themselves from the walls. Dozens of them, vaguely human-shaped, with glowing eyes and grasping hands. "You see, not," Mr. Smith continued, his head slowly rotating to face forward again with a sickening series of cracks. "When you reopened this place, you let us all back in. And now, we're never letting you leave." The shadows surged forward. Jack grabbed my hand, yanking me back into the hallway. "Run!" he shouted. We fled down the corridor, the sound of inhuman laughter echoing behind us. But as we reached the top of the stairs, I realized with horror that more shadows were streaming up from the lobby, cutting off our escape. We were trapped. Jack and I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, shadows closing in from both sides. The thing that used to be Mr. Smith approached slowly, savoring our fear. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. It tilted its head, an unsettling imitation of curiosity. "Want, my dear? We simply want what was promised to us. What was stolen from us so long ago." Jack's grip on my hand tightened. "We don't understand," he said, voice shaking. "We just bought this place to renovate it. We didn't steal anything." The creature laughed, a sound like bones grinding together. "Oh, but you did. You stole our home, our hunting grounds." As it spoke, the shadows drew closer. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, hear their whispers in my ears. Fragments of memories not my own flashed through my mind. Straitjackets, padded cells, screams echoing down endless corridors. This was never just a hospital, I realized aloud. It was a prison, for them. Not Mr. Smith's grin widened impossibly. "Very good. You see, The doctors here. They knew what we were, what we could do. They tried to contain us, to study us. But we were too strong, too hungry. Jack shook his head. That's impossible. Willowbrow closed down over 50 years ago. You can't be. Means nothing to us, the creature snarled. We waited. We grew stronger. And now, thanks to you two, we're free again. The shadows surged forward, and I knew we had only seconds left. In desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass lamp from a side table, and swung it at not Mr. Smith's head. To my shock, it connected with a sickening crunch. The creature howled, more in rage than pain, and the shadows recoiled momentarily. The attic. I shouted to Jack, "There's another staircase in the old servants' quarters." We bolted down the hallway, the sounds of pursuit close behind. I led Jack to a hidden door I'd discovered during renovations, praying it would still open. It did, revealing a narrow staircase. We raced up, slamming the door behind us. Jack wedged a broken chair under the handle, but we both knew it wouldn't hold for long. The attic was a maze of old furniture and forgotten relics. Dust swirled in the air, making it hard to breathe. We navigated by moonlight streaming through a single circular window. There, Jack pointed to a hatch in the ceiling. It must lead to the roof. As he reached for it, a cold hand wrapped around my ankle. I screamed, kicking out at the shadow that had somehow slipped through the floorboards. Jack whirled around, grabbing a rusty fire poker. He swung it through the shadow, which dissipated with an unearthly shriek. More shadows were seeping in now, and the door at the bottom of the stairs splintered with a thunderous crack. "Go!" I yelled at Jack. "Open the hatch." He hesitated for a split second, then nodded. As he struggled with the rusted latch, I fended off the encroaching darkness with wild swings of the fire poker. Finally, the hatch creaked open. Jack pulled himself up, then reached back to help me. Just as my fingers brushed his, something wrapped around my waist, yanking me backward. I screamed, clawing at the attic floor. Not Mr. Smith's distorted face loomed over me, jaws unhinged to reveal that more full of needle teeth. "You're not going anywhere," it hissed. Jack lunged forward, grabbing my arms. For a moment, I was suspended between two forces, Jack pulling me towards safety, and the creature dragging me back into darkness. "Let her go," Jack shouted, straining with effort. The creature's only response was a bone-chilling laugh. I could feel my grip on Jack's hand slipping. The shadows were creeping up my body, their touch burning like ice. In that moment, I knew with terrifying certainty that if I let go, I would be lost forever. "Jack," I gasped out. "Whatever happens, don't let go. Please." His eyes met mine, filled with determination and fear. "Never," he promised. The shadows surged forward, enveloping us both. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. All I knew was the feeling of Jack's hands in mine as we were pulled in opposite directions. Something had to give. And then, with a deafening roar that shook the entire building, it did. The roar grew louder, drowning out even the inhuman shrieks of the shadows. Suddenly, I felt a rush of cool air. Jack gave one final, desperate tug, and I flew upward, out of the grasping darkness and onto the roof. We scrambled away from the open hatch, gasping for breath. Below us, the creature that was once Mr. Smith howled in fury, but something else was happening. The entire building had begun to shake violently. Cracks spider-webbed across the roof beneath our feet, and a deep groaning sound came from within the walls. The foundation. Jack yelled over the noise. When we renovated, we must have weakened it somehow. I watched in horrified as the grand old building began to collapse in on itself. The shadows writhed and twisted, trying to escape, but they seemed bound to the structure. Their screams mingled with the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. Jack pulled me to the edge of the roof. "We have to jump." I looked down at the ground, dizzyingly far below. "We'll never survive that fall." "We don't have a choice." He was right. The roof was crumbling beneath us. It was jump or be dragged down with the hotel and its monstrous inhabitants. Hand in hand, we leapt. I'd like to say I remembered some profound thought as we fell, or that my life flashed before my eyes. But honestly, all I remember is screaming. We hit something softer than the ground, the awning over the front entrance. I realized later, it slowed our fall just enough. We bounced off and landed hard on the gravel driveway. Everything hurt, but we were alive. We crawled away from the collapsing building, turning to watch as the old Willowbrook Hotel, our dream, our nightmare, imploded in a cloud of dust and unearthly wails. As the dust settled, an eerie silence fell. No more screams, no more shadows, just the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Jack pulled me close, his body shaking with sobs of relief. I clung to him, hardly daring to believe we'd survived. That was 3 months ago. The official story is that we accidentally triggered a sinkhole during renovations. There were a lot of questions, of course, about Mr. Smith, whose rental car was found abandoned miles away, about why we were on the roof, about the screams neighbors swore they heard that night. We gave them our best answers. But some things, most things, we kept to ourselves. We sold the land. There's nothing left but rubble now, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear something in the distance. A voice, faint but unmistakable, carried on the breeze. Come back, but we never will. I never thought I'd be sitting here, typing this out, trying to make sense of what happened. My name's Jeremiah Lapp, and a few days ago, I went on what was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. Instead, I ended up in a place I can't explain, and I might not be able to get out of it either. It all started the day before whitetail season. I found a secluded patch of public land that seemed untouched by other hunters. It was the perfect spot to set up my ladder stand. Excitement buzzed in my veins as I lugged that heavy thing deep into the woods, about a few 100 yards in. It was a hassle, but it would be worth it once I got my shot at a big buck. The night before opening day, I barely slept. I had that feeling, you know, the one where you just know something good is going to happen. As the first light crept over the horizon the next morning, I was already in my truck, making my way back to the stand. It was pitch black when I arrived. The air had that damp chill that only comes right before dawn. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my penlight, and started navigating through the dense woods. Every few steps, I stopped to flash the light on the ground, making sure I was still on the right track. The woods were eerily quiet, like they were holding their breath. I finally saw the silhouette of my ladder stand in the dark. After carefully climbing up, I settled into the padded seat and got my rifle ready, securing the hammer into the half-cock position. All I had to do now was wait. The woods were still, almost unnervingly so. It was just minutes before dawn, and I could feel that icy grip of cold sink in. But soon enough, the light started filtering through the trees, and I closed my eyes for just a moment, leaning back against the trunk. When I opened them again, I couldn't believe what I saw. 20 yards in front of me stood the biggest buck I'd ever seen in my life. My heart was in my throat as I tried to steady my shaking hands. Its antlers gleamed in the early morning light like they were glowing. Slowly, I moved the rifle into position and aimed, exhaling as I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the woods, and the buck stumbled before darting deeper into the trees. I couldn't contain my excitement. I knew I had made a good shot. That buck wouldn't make it far. I scrambled down the ladder in my haste, eager to track the blood trail. Just as my boots hit the ground, I heard another gunshot close by. Someone must have seen the buck too, I thought, and panic surged through me. I bolted after the animal, following the trail of blood. But as I went deeper into the woods, something didn't feel right. The blood trail kept going, far longer than any wounded buck should have been able to run. The second strange thing, the sun wasn't moving. It was still exactly where it had been when I fired my shot, just barely peeking over the horizon. I had been walking for what felt like an hour, but the light hadn't changed. I finally came to the top of a small hill, and there, in the middle of the clearing below, was a campsite. A green canvas tent stood between a few old cedar trees. It was quiet, too quiet. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "I'm looking for my buck. Anyone here?" No answer. Just the wind rustling the trees. I walked down into the campsite, taking in the odd scene. There was a folding table near the fire pit, with an old transistor radio and a lantern, the kind you pump up and light with oil, not the lead ones people use these days. The gear looked ancient, like something out of a different era. I picked up the lantern, feeling its weight. It didn't belong here. "Hipsters," I muttered under my breath, setting it back on the table. I crouched down and peeked into the tent. Two sleeping bags, rumpled and empty. Whoever had been here wasn't any more. I straightened up, deciding to move on and pick up the blood trail again. But something about this place was wrong. As I walked away from the campsite, the woods opened up onto a narrow dirt road. Parked on the side was an old International pickup, with a large water tank in the back. The tank was catching water from a spring, pristine, clear water trickling into it like it had been flowing for decades. That's when I saw him. A tall man stood by the truck, his back to me. He wore an old felt hat, sun-faded and worn with age. His frame was lean but strong, like someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, walking toward him. He turned, startled, and his hand went to the small of his back. Instinctively, I raised my hands, signaling I wasn't a threat. "I'm looking for my buck," I said. "I shot it not too far from here." Heard another gunshot. Thought maybe you had seen it. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his weathered face lined with age, but his eyes, they were hollow, empty. "Sir." I tried again, stepping closer. He didn't move, didn't blink, just kept watching me. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he pointed back the way I had come. "You need to go," he said in a raspy voice that sent a chill down my spine. "You ain't supposed to be here." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he was already turning away, heading toward the woods, his figure disappearing into the shadows like he had never been there at all. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the feeling of unease growing in my gut. Something was very wrong with this place. The sun still hadn't moved. The woods around me were too still, and that man, there was something unnatural about him. I looked around, searching for any sign of my buck, but I saw nothing. No more blood trail, no footprints, nothing. I decided to leave. The hunt wasn't worth it anymore. As I turned to go, the distant sound of a gunshot echoed through the trees again. And then another, and another. Each one was closer. I ran, not caring about direction, not caring about anything but getting out of those woods. But no matter how far I went, the sun never moved, and the gunshots followed, relentless, like they were hunting me now. Now, as I sit here, writing this, I don't know where I am. I can still hear the gunshots, but they've stopped getting closer. It's like the woods are holding me here, in this endless twilight. If you're reading this, if this note makes it out, don't come looking for me. Don't come looking for this place, because once you're here, the woods don't let go, and I don't think they ever will. I stared at the note on Jeremiah's phone, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't explain what had happened to him in the hospital, but it was clear something beyond the ordinary had happened out there. I just hope, whatever it is, it hasn't followed him back. Even though one hand held a rifle, I spoke quickly and clearly. I was just out doing some hunting, and I'm looking for my deer. The old man just stared back at me, and blinking. Now that I got a good look at him, there was something oddly familiar about his face, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. "Have you seen it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He slowly shook his head from side to side, never breaking eye contact. "Okay, well, I'll just be going then." The tension between us seemed to ease as his arms dropped to his sides. I smiled awkwardly, lowering my hands as slowly as possible. "I like the truck," I said, gesturing toward the old pickup with the hand that wasn't holding the rifle. He continued to stare at me, expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a minute, he finally spoke. "It's been a good one," he said, his voice deep and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. I nodded too enthusiastically, just relieved that he was responding. "I like the beard," he added, rubbing a hand over his salt and pepper stubble. I smiled awkwardly and turned to glance at my reflection in the truck's passenger side window. There I stood, short and stocky, with the bushy beard of a mountain man, but something was off. I moved closer to the window, my breath catching in my throat. My skin was ghostly pale. I touched my face, my fingers trembling as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked down at my hands, but they were the same, pale, almost translucent. My panic was interrupted by the old man's voice. "I don't think you're going to find that buck." His tone had shifted, now somber and heavy with meaning. I turned back to him, my voice shaking. "Why not? Have you seen it?" I scanned the road, hoping for any sign of the animal. "No, I haven't seen it." He hesitated, then walked over to the driver's side of his truck. "But you should know there's something following you." I whipped my head back toward the woods. "What do you mean? What's following me?" "It's different for everyone," he said slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "So I'm not sure, but it's best to go toward it, rather than try to get away." "What the hell are you talking about?" I shouted, frustration and fear bubbling up inside me, but he didn't seem to hear me. He was already climbing into the old truck, the engine sputtering to life as he closed the door. He gave me one last wave as he pulled away, the truck's tires kicking up a cloud of dust. "Crazy old coot," I muttered under my breath, backing away from the dust cloud. But his words lingered in my mind. Something was following me. I'd heard a twig snap behind me earlier, but I had dismissed it as a raccoon or an opossum. Now I wasn't so sure. Shaking my head, I tried to clear my thoughts. "Focus," I told myself. "Get back to the truck, grab some water, and rest. Then you can track that buck." I turned back toward the woods and started retracing my steps, trying to reassure myself that I was fine. But as I walked deeper into the forest, a twig snapped in the distance. I stopped, scanning the dense brush for movement. Nothing. Damn it. I'm losing it, I muttered, picking up the pace. I soon crested the hill I had crossed earlier and froze in my tracks. The campsite I had passed before, it couldn't be. But there it was again, only now it was destroyed. The green canvas tent was shredded, its pieces fluttering in the breeze. The folding table was overturned, and the lanterns that had sat upon it lay shattered on the ground. What the hell? I whispered, my voice barely audible. I was just here. There was no way this could have happened so quickly. I had been no more than 100 feet away and hadn't heard a single sound. Suddenly, a deep growl rumbled from behind me, low and menacing. My heart hammered against my ribcage, my pulse roaring in my ears. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, but when I touched it, something warm and wet greeted my fingers. I pulled my hand away and stared in horror. It was covered in blood. What the? I whispered, staring at the crimson stain as panic gripped me. I looked down and saw that I was standing in a pool of blood. My knees buckled, and I began trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, I turned around and saw bloody footprints. My bloody footprints. Before I could comprehend what was happening, a violent thrashing sound erupted from the shadows. Terror surged through me, and I bolted, sprinting blindly through the woods. My mind raced as fast as my legs, and sure of what direction to go, and sure of anything. I didn't see the tree root until it was too late. My foot snagged on it, sending me crashing to the ground. Darkness engulfed me. When I opened my eyes, my vision was blurry, and a searing pain shot through my chest. Dazed and disoriented, I staggered to my feet, clutching onto trees for support as I stumbled forward. I prayed. I was heading toward my truck. Through the haze, I spotted a break in the trees. My truck. It was sitting in a field, just ahead. I took one more step, and everything went black. I woke to the sound of crackling. Slowly, I opened my eyes and found myself staring up at the night sky. The stars above were brighter than I had ever seen them. I turned my head and saw a small fire nearby. The old man from the spring was tending it. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. Easy, son. As if reading my mind, the man pointed to a nearby log. It's there. I exhaled shakily, trying to steady my thoughts. What are you doing here, me? Well, I'm gonna help you make it out. Out of the forest. Yeah, kinda. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He poked the fire with a stick, seemingly deep in thought. Let me ask you some questions, he finally said. How close was that second shot? I don't know, I replied, still trying to process everything. Couldn't have been more than a few yards away. The old man stared into the distance, his expression unreadable. You seen any strange things since you've been looking for that buck? You mean besides you? I scoffed. And how'd you know it was a buck? I only said deer earlier. He chuckled softly, pushing up his old felt hat to scratch his head. Yeah, I'm mighty strange to you, I expect. And as for the buck, I know a lot of things. But I'm afraid I don't have time to explain everything to you. You keep saying you don't have time, I said, irritation creeping into my voice. What do you mean by that? He sighed and stood up, dusting off his hands. We've got to get going before it finds you. Before what finds me? I demanded, my frustration mounting. I can't explain it to you, he said, his tone more urgent now. You wouldn't believe me anyway. We need to get you to the river. I frowned. There's no river around here. He smiled knowingly. You'll see. You crossed it to get here, even if you don't remember. You're tougher than I thought. I think you can make it back to the other side." Without waiting for a response, the old man turned and started making his way through the brush. I had no choice but to follow. I quickened my pace to keep up with the old man's long stride, my mind racing with questions. "I think there might be some other people out here in trouble," I said, still rattled by the shredded campsite. "Why? Did you see someone else?" the old man asked without breaking his stride. "No, but there was a campsite. One minute it was fine, the next it was in shambles." He didn't even glance at me. "You can't trust what you see out here. Anything you see has already happened. You can't help anyone." I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised his hand, silencing me. His gnarled finger pointed to a briar patch a few feet away. I squinted, trying to see what he was showing me, and then I saw it. The buck I had shot stood up, but something was terribly wrong. Its eyes were ghostly white, milky and dead. Flies and all sorts of insects buzzed around the rotting bullet wound in its side. The stench of decay hit me like a wave. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in disbelief. The old man whispered, "Wait, wait, but panic took over, and I turned to run. Before I could take a single step, a large, dark figure exploded through the brush. I fell backward, crawling away in terror. A black bear towered on its hind legs in front of me, its eyes just like the buck's, white and lifeless. The fur around its face was lighter than the rest of its body, forming a pattern that looked like a gray skull. The skin on its lower jaw had rotted away, exposing jagged teeth dripping with blood and bile. The beast roared, and I froze in place, paralyzed with fear. Its massive paw swiped down at me, and I barely rolled out of the way in time. I stumbled to my feet, adrenaline surging through me as the bear charged. I looked around for the old man, but he had vanished. The bear roared again, its fetid breath hot on my back. At the last second, I flung myself to the side, narrowly escaping its charge. I ran blindly through the forest, hoping, praying I was going in the right direction. The sound of the bear crashing through the brush behind me filled my ears, getting louder with every step. Finally, I skidded to a stop at the edge of a steep bank overlooking a river. Out of nowhere, the old man appeared beside me, as calm as ever. "You have to go now," he shouted over the roar of the rushing water. "Are you sure this is the way?" I asked, breathless and panicked. "Yes," he nodded, his voice steady. "Oh, and you'll need these to get across." He reached into his pocket and held out two strange-looking silver coins. I grabbed them, confused. The coins were old and worn, barely recognizable. I squinted at the faint outline of an owl etched into them. Why would I nay? Before I could finish, the old man shoved me into the river. The water was dark green, thick with the smell of decay. I struggled to keep my head above the surface as the current pulled me downstream. Gasping for air, I glanced back toward the bank. I could have sworn I saw the old man and the bear standing side by side, just watching me swim across. I made it to the other side, dragging myself up the muddy bank, but as soon as I reached dry land, exhaustion overtook me. My limbs felt heavy, my vision blurred. Somehow, in what felt like no time at all, I found myself standing next to my truck. I stumbled toward the driver's side door, my body on autopilot. Fumbling through my pockets, I realized my keys were gone. "Shit," I muttered, slumping against the side of the truck. I must have dropped them in the river. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing second, and soon I could barely keep them open. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. That's when I started typing this note. I hope someone fee. The doctors came and talked to me earlier this morning, and I finally got to see Jeremiah. They say he's lucky to be alive. Apparently, he fell out of his tree stand while trying to get down. The rifle went off and shot him in the chest. They said the fact that he survived at all was a miracle, but they're concerned about his mental state. One doctor pulled me aside and told me Jeremiah seemed confused about what happened out there. Maybe it's the pain medication or the trauma of the whole ordeal, but he keeps talking about things that ... don't make sense. I went in to see him, trying to put on a brave face. I told him I'd read his note. He looked at me with those tired eyes and asked if they'd found the old man or the bear. I didn't know what to say, so I told him the truth. There aren't any bears in this part of the state, I said, keeping my voice calm. And no one lives within 10 miles of where you were found. But Jeremiah wouldn't let it go. He swore up and down that the bear had been right beside his truck, roaring just before they found him. I told him his head had been slumped against the steering wheel, pressing the horn. That's how the search team had found him. His face went pale, and for a moment I thought I'd finally gotten through to him. After a long silence, he looked over to the orange hazmat bin in the corner of the room. Sticking out from the top was a sleeve of the flannel shirt he'd been wearing when they found him. "Can you get it for me?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. I wasn't supposed to touch anything that had been sealed in that bin. "I don't think I'm allowed," I said, trying to deflect. But he insisted. Reluctantly, I opened the bin and pulled out the blood-stained shirt. "Why do you want this?" I asked, puzzled. Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He just fished around in the front pocket of the shirt, his fingers trembling. After a moment, he pulled out 2 of the strangest-looking silver coins I had ever seen. They looked old, worn, with the faint image of an owl barely visible on the surface, exactly like the ones he described. I spent the first few hours poring over the texts we'd already found, meticulously comparing them with my translations. The weight of what I had to accomplish over the next 10 days hung over me like a looming storm. I had no room for mistakes. The story that was unfolding in these texts was unlike anything we had seen before. Native Americans with traces of Spanish influence in their language, something no one had expected. It wasn't just the linguistic mix that was unusual. There were disturbing details scattered throughout the writings. References to a great beast that had come in the night. At first, I dismissed it as metaphorical, but the blood stains and the condition of the village had me reconsidering everything. As I sat there, hunched over ancient tablets, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing, something deliberately hidden in the texts or within the ruins themselves. A part of me wished it was as simple as a rabid bear attack, but there was a gnawing suspicion in the back of my mind that this story wasn't going to end with a mundane explanation. The next morning, I decided to start exploring the village again, hoping to find new clues that might help. The forest surrounding the ruins was dense and overgrown, nature having reclaimed most of what remained of the settlement. As I walked through the village, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't uncommon for researchers to feel a bit of unease in isolated places, but this was different. The trees seemed to whisper, and the wind carried an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I made my way to the largest structure in the village, a central hut that had collapsed under the weight of time. The blood-stained remnants of the villagers' belongings were scattered all around. But as I moved debris out of the way, I found something that stopped me cold, a stone carving embedded in the earth. It was crude but unmistakable. It depicted a creature, unlike anything I had seen before. A tall, slender figure with long claws and eyes that seemed to follow you, even though they were just shallow indentations in the rock. Was this the beast the villagers had written about? Suddenly, the village felt smaller, the trees closer. I stood up, my eyes scanning the forest line. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I needed to get back to the camp and document this find. Back in the temporary research camp, I couldn't stop thinking about the carving. I took detailed notes and sent photos to the Smithsonian team, but something told me that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be easy to explain. The villagers had escaped their Spanish captors, yes, but what had they escaped to? Over the next few days, I dove deeper into the translations. More mentions of the beast, more descriptions of how it would come at night, tearing through the village, leaving carnage in its wake. The villagers had tried to fight back. They described rituals, offerings, and even attempts to leave the beast offerings in the hope that it would spare them. But it never did. On the 5th night, I had a nightmare that woke me in a cold sweat. I was back in the village, standing before the same stone carving. But in my dream, the beast wasn't just a figure carved into stone. It was alive, watching me from the edge of the village, waiting for me to let my guard down. Its eyes were cold and calculating, and it moved with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. The dream felt too real, too vivid. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled into my bones. By the 7th day, I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Something was pushing me forward, a deep need to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I combed through every inch of the village, every scrap of text, trying to piece together what had happened here. The more I read, the more I became convinced that the villagers hadn't died of disease or a simple animal attack. They had been hunted by something that wasn't supposed to exist. On the 9th day, just as I was preparing to submit my final report to the council, I found it. Hidden in the remains of a collapsed shelter was a tablet, much older than the others, its surface worn and cracked with age. The language was different, more primitive, but I could make out the gist of it. It was a warning left by the original inhabitants of the area, long before the Spanish had arrived, long before the village had been built. They spoke of a creature, an ancient being that lived deep in the forest, a being that demanded blood, a being that was older than the trees themselves, older than the land. I took a deep breath as I realized what I was reading. The villagers hadn't just fled the Spanish. They had fled from something much older and far more dangerous. Something that had followed them. I had 10 days to uncover the truth, and I had done it. But now, as I sat in my tent, the sun setting on the final day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something I wasn't meant to. The forest was too quiet, the air too still. As I packed my notes and prepared to leave, I looked once more at the stone carving I had found on the 2nd day. The beast, it was just a carving, I told myself, just a remnant of a long-dead civilization. But as the wind picked up and the trees began to sway, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. And this time, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The moment the wall crumbled, a gust of putrid, stale air rushed out from the newly opened chamber. It was as if the cave had been sealed for centuries, the foul odor of decay hanging in the air. Dust swirled around, and my heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what just happened. "Are you okay, Doc?" Fred, one of the spelunkers, asked, waving the dust away from his face. His nonchalant attitude irritated me, considering what had just been revealed. The words I had just translated echoed in my mind. Here lies the remaining skinwalkers. The disease will destroy everything. Skinwalkers. The word wasn't just a random choice. It was a name associated with legends, myths that spoke of shapeshifters, beings that could take the form of animals or humans, often associated with malevolent intent. But what really sent shivers down my spine was the mention of a disease. What disease had wiped out this ancient village? And more importantly, could it still exist? As I stared into the darkness of the newly revealed tunnel, I could feel something. It wasn't a physical sensation but a presence, a heaviness in the air, a sense that we had disturbed something that had been long forgotten for a reason. Dr. Whitney, now at my side, was equally entranced by the sight. "What do you think this means?" she asked quietly, her earlier excitement tempered by the gravity of the moment. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "But whatever it is, we might have just unleashed something." Suddenly Greg, the leader of the spelunkers, broke the silence with his usual bravado. "All right, folks, enough spooky talk. Let's see what treasure they were hiding back here." He turned on his flashlight and started to walk through the crumbled wall, Fred and Scott following closely behind him. I wanted to yell at them to stop, to think about what they were doing, but the words caught in my throat. My instincts screamed danger, but there was also a part of me that was driven by curiosity, the same curiosity that had brought me here in the first place. Against my better judgment, I followed them into the tunnel. The chamber beyond was larger than I had anticipated, its ceiling stretching far above us, barely visible even with our flashlights. The walls were lined with strange, twisted carvings, humanoid figures mixed with animalistic shapes, their faces distorted into grotesque expressions. It felt like the cave itself was alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that made my skin crawl. "What the hell is this place?" Scott muttered under his breath as he ran his flashlight across the walls. The carvings seemed to twist and shift in the shadows, playing tricks on our minds. Kevin, the youngest of the team, approached a large stone slab in the center of the chamber. His flashlight revealed a series of symbols etched into the surface, similar to the ones on the tablet I had just translated. He knelt down to examine it more closely, brushing away the dirt with his gloved hand. "Guys, look at this," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. We gathered around the slab, the symbols appearing clearer now. It was another message, but this time it wasn't written in the same stylized Spanish. It was something much older, much more archaic. I couldn't make out all of it, but there were enough familiar elements that I could piece together a rough translation. The beast within must never be awoken. Death comes in many forms, but none more vile than those who wear the skins of the fallen. A chill ran down my spine. The carvings on the walls, the symbols on the slab, it all pointed to something far more sinister than we had imagined. "Skinwalkers," I whispered, the word feeling heavy in my mouth. Greg, always the skeptic, chuckled. "You really believe in that stuff? Come on. It's just old superstition. They probably just use these stories to scare people away from their village." I didn't respond. It wasn't about belief anymore. It was about the undeniable feeling that we had crossed a line, that whatever lay dormant in this cave had been disturbed. The air was thick with dread, and I could see it in the eyes of the others, even if they wouldn't admit it. Suddenly, a low rumbling sound echoed through the chamber. At first, we thought it was just the cave settling after the wall collapse, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from deeper within the cave. "What the hell is that?" Fred asked, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us shook violently, knocking us all off balance. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the walls trembled, the carvings seeming to warp and twist in the flickering light. "We need to get out of here, now," I shouted, my voice filled with panic. But as we scrambled to our feet, a deafening roar echoed from the darkness ahead. It wasn't the sound of shifting earth or falling rocks. It was something alive. Something massive. Greg, who had been standing closest to the tunnel, froze in place, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his bravado completely shattered. I didn't need to answer. We all knew what it was, even if we didn't want to admit it. The beast. The one the villagers had written about. The one they had sealed away. And now, thanks to us, it was awake. "Run!" I screamed, and we bolted for the exit. The ground shook with every step we took, the roar of the beast growing louder behind us. As we reached the cave entrance, I dared to glance back. A pair of glowing eyes stared at us from the darkness, and I knew, without a doubt, that we had unleashed something far worse than we could ever imagine. The eerie silence outside the van made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Snowflakes drifted down like frozen ash, but the stillness of the forest felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Despite being surrounded by people, I felt utterly alone, exposed to whatever lurked beyond the tree line. Fred, looking as pale as the snow itself, muttered under his breath, "We should have left the moment we saw that thing." Greg, ever the stubborn leader, stood nearby, his brow furrowed in frustration. "We can't just leave. We don't even know what that thing was. We need more information. What if this is tied to the disease, the village?" I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. Something unseen but unmistakable weighed heavily in the air, watching, waiting for us to make a move. The others seemed to feel it too. Dr. Will had gone unnaturally quiet since the encounter. His usual confidence was replaced with nervous glances over his shoulder, and Fred kept fidgeting, his eyes darting toward the tree line as if expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. "Where's Christina?" I asked, breaking the silence. Everyone exchanged uncertain glances. "She hasn't been seen since yesterday," Kevin said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought she was with the tents, but maybe she went into the cave." "No way," Greg said, shaking his head. "Christina wouldn't do that. She's smarter than that." Yet, something gnawed at me. Christina had been prepared, more than any of us. She had insisted on the exclusion suits, on bringing more supplies than we thought necessary. What if she knew something from the start? "We should check the caves again," I said, but the idea was met with immediate resistance. Fred shook his head violently. "Absolutely not. Did you forget what we saw in there? The tablet, the creature. We're lucky we made it out alive. And if it's still there," I challenged, "if it followed us?" A heavy silence fell over the group. The reality that we were being hunted, stalked by something that shouldn't exist, settled over everyone. The van, though small and cramped, suddenly felt like the only thing between us and whatever lurked in the shadows. "We can't stay here forever," Dr. Will said, finally speaking up. His voice was steady, but there was fear in his eyes. "That thing, whatever it is, it's connected to the disease. Maybe the village, but we're not equipped to deal with it. We need to leave and bring in experts." For the first time, I agreed with him. Whatever ancient evil had been trapped in the cave had been released, and it was beyond anything we could understand. The best we could do was retreat, regroup, and figure out how to contain it, if that was even possible. Greg, however, was still stubborn. "We can't just abandon this. We've spent months here. We're on the edge of something big. If we leave now, we'll never be able to come back." But even he knew the truth. We had already gone too far. The expedition was over the moment we broke that wall, the moment we let the creature out. "Greg," I said firmly, "we need to leave, now." Another silence fell over the group, but this time it was Greg's turn to relent. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right. But we need to find Christina first." As we began preparing to leave, the unsettling quiet persisted. The snow crunched under our boots as we trudged through the camp, searching for any sign of Christina. The sky was growing darker, the sun barely aglow on the horizon. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that something terrible was closing in on us. Suddenly, from the direction of the cave, we heard a sound. A low, guttural growl that reverberated through the cold air. We all froze, our hearts pounding in unison. "What the hell was that?" Scott whispered, clutching his flashlight with white knuckles. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. Something was coming. We had to move fast. "Head back to the van," I ordered. But as we turned to leave, we saw her. Christina. She was standing at the edge of the tree line, her back to us. She was still, unnaturally still, as if frozen in place by the cold. "Christina!" Fred shouted, relief washing over him. "Where the hell have you been?" But she didn't respond. Something was wrong. I could feel it. "Christina!" I called out cautiously, taking a few steps closer. "Are you all right?" Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. It was pale, paler than it should have been, even in the cold. Her eyes were wide, vacant, staring at something none of us could see. "Christina!" I repeated, my voice trembling. "What happened?" She didn't answer. Instead, her body slowly began to move, jerking, twitching, like a puppet on strings. Her limbs twisted in unnatural directions, and as she turned fully toward us, we saw it. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her eyes hollow, lifeless. And behind her, barely visible in the growing darkness, stood the creature. Its skeletal frame was hunched, black skin clinging to bone, its head once again turned at an unnatural angle. But this time, it wasn't just watching us. It was controlling her. "Run!" Greg screamed, but it was too late. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech, and Christina lunged toward us, her movements erratic and horrifying. There was no time to think, only time to act. We bolted for the van, stumbling over the snow-covered ground as Christina, or whatever she had become, gave chase. The creature followed closely behind, its bony limbs skittering across the snow like a monstrous spider. We reached the van and threw open the doors, piling inside, just as Christina's distorted figure slammed against the side. Her hollow eyes stared at us through the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she clawed at the door. The creature's screech echoed through the forest, and for a moment I thought it would break through. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the noise stopped. Christina slumped against the van, her body lifeless once again. The creature melted into the shadows, retreating into the dark. We sat in stunned silence, too terrified to move, too exhausted to process what had just happened. All I knew was one thing. We were no longer alone, and whatever had been unleashed, it wasn't finished with us yet. The sound echoed through the forest, reverberating off the frozen trees and shaking the ground beneath our feet. I wasn't sure where the explosion had come from, but it was loud enough to stop our hearts for a moment. What was that? Christina screamed, instinctively grabbing another flaming stick from the campfire. We all scanned the tree line, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the shadows. The wind had picked up, swirling snow into the air and masking the horizon with a thick white haze. Visibility was next to nothing, and our nerves were frayed to the point of breaking. "Whatever it is, it's getting closer," Tamia said, her voice tight with anxiety. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the growing dread that had been building since the quakes. The creatures we'd set on fire just moments before were gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had gotten worse. What if fire wasn't their weakness? Christina said, staring into the empty space where the van had been moments before. "Then what is?" I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. "We don't have time to experiment. Those things will be back any minute." Tamia knelt by the campfire, her fingers tracing symbols into the snow. She muttered something under her breath, barely audible over the howl of the wind. "It's not just about the fire. The color brown, the beast's bane. It has to mean something more. It can't just be fire or the trees." "Then what?" Greg said, frustration evident. "What does it mean?" Tamia looked up at us, her face pale, but her eyes determined. "I don't know, but I think it's the earth, the earth." I echoed, confused. She stood up, dusting the snow off her knees. "Yes, the earth. Maybe these creatures aren't just afraid of fire. Maybe they're tied to the ground itself, buried under it, trapped by it. The villagers sealed them underground, after all. Maybe we need to use the earth to trap them again." Christina's eyes widened in realization. "Like a circle, a boundary made of earth. We don't have time for this," Greg shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "They're going to come back any second. We need to run." But before anyone could move, another growl echoed from the forest, louder and more menacing than before. The snow parted just beyond the campfire, and emerging from the darkness was the first creature we had encountered, the skeletal, twisted figure with its head still grotesquely turned the wrong way. And behind it, more were coming. The white-haired one, the dog-like one. Dozens of them, all shapes and sizes, emerging from the forest like nightmares brought to life. "No more running," Christina said, standing tall with the flaming stick still clutched in her hand. "Tamia's right. We need to fight back. Fight them." Fred shouted. "With what?" Tamia knelt quickly and began scooping up handfuls of earth, throwing them in a circle around the fire. "We need to trap them, the earth. It's the only thing that will hold them." I joined her, grabbing snow and dirt with my bare hands and flinging it in a wide arc around the campsite. The others, caught between terror and hope, hesitated for a moment before following suit. We all moved frantically, creating a crude but effective circle around the fire. The creatures drew closer. Their guttural growls and ragged breaths filled the air. The one with the wide blue eyes and the long strand of white hair was leading them now, its gaze locked on us, its twisted form moving with terrifying purpose. "They're coming!" Greg screamed, holding up a branch defensively. The creatures were nearly upon us, their distorted limbs moving impossibly fast over the snow-covered ground. Just as they reached the edge of the circle, something extraordinary happened. The moment their grotesque, rotting limbs crossed the boundary of dirt and snow, they recoiled in agony. The earth itself seemed to resist them, glowing faintly at the edges of the circle as if charged with some unseen energy. "It's working!" Tamia shouted, her voice filled with awe and relief. The creatures screeched, a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. They thrashed violently, trying to break through the invisible barrier that the earth had created, but they couldn't cross. The boundary held them at bay. The ground beneath us began to rumble again. But this time it wasn't an earthquake. It was something else, something ancient and powerful, as though the earth itself was reacting to the presence of the monsters. Suddenly, the ground split open, and out of the cracks, thick tendrils of roots and soil emerged, wrapping themselves around the creatures. The infected screeched and struggled, but the roots dragged them down, pulling them deep into the earth. One by one, the monsters were consumed by the soil, their haunting cries growing fainter and fainter, until they were silenced entirely. The last one to go was the white-haired creature, its wide blue eyes staring at us in defiance as the earth swallowed it whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the ground sealed itself shut. The forest was silent once again. We stood there, stunned, panting from the effort and the terror. It was over. The creatures were gone. Tamia collapsed onto the snow, exhausted but triumphant. The earth ... It really was the answer. Christina dropped her flaming stick and let out a shaky breath. I can't believe it. We actually did it. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The creatures had been trapped once before, and now they had escaped. How long before they found a way out again? As we gathered around the campfire, the snow falling softly around us, I couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets did this cursed land hold? And had we truly escaped the nightmare, or had we merely delayed the inevitable? Day 10. The sun crept over the horizon, casting a pale orange glow on the snow-covered forest, illuminating the aftermath of the longest night of our lives. My hands were still trembling as I leaned against the jagged rocks outside the cave, my copper spear still clutched tightly. Around us, the air was eerily quiet again, the calm after the storm. No more screeching, no more growls, no more infected chasing us through those cursed tunnels. We had done it. The original, the one that had stalked us from the start, lay twisted and broken in the dirt, its dried, grotesque body shriveled even more after being impaled by our copper weapons. The infection that had threatened to overrun the camp, the village, and perhaps the entire region was now just a memory, a nightmare we'd all carry with us for the rest of our lives. I dropped my spear and sank to my knees, exhaustion overwhelming me. The adrenaline that had kept me going was gone, and in its place was the dull ache of muscles pushed past their limit. Around me, the others collapsed too. Tamia, Christina, Greg, all of us were barely holding on. We made it, Christina whispered, her voice hoarse from the hours of screaming and fighting. I can't believe we made it. Barely, Tamia muttered, wincing as she tried to stretch out her legs. But yeah, we did. I glanced at the entrance to the cave, now sealed off for good. We had taken the last of the copper from the walls and collapsed the tunnels behind us as we escaped. No more infected would come crawling out of that cursed hole ever again. The earth had reclaimed them, just like it had done centuries ago. Greg stood up slowly, surveying the area around us. So ... what now? His question hung in the air. What did we do now? We had survived the nightmare, but at what cost? Our team was gone. Those who hadn't been killed by the creatures had vanished in the chaos of the last few days. The camp was destroyed, our supplies mostly gone, and the research we'd come to this forsaken place for was reduced to rubble. I felt a pang of guilt for a moment, remembering what had brought us here in the first place. We hadn't come to save the world or to battle an ancient infection. We'd come here for glory, for scientific discovery, and for the thrill of solving a centuries-old mystery. In the end, we'd found more than we bargained for.